Welcome to Sleepy Sagas, where historical figures come to entertain your sleep. The Battle of Nicopolis in 1396 marked a crushing defeat for Sigismund of Hungary, as his forces were obliterated by the relentless Ottoman Empire. However, rather than reflect on the loss or seek atonement, Sigismund's return to Hungary was fueled by an insatiable thirst for revenge. The defeat did not humble him. Instead, it awakened a savage desire to punish those he blamed for the failure. He turned his wrath on both the French and Hungarian nobility, seeing them as scapegoats for his downfall. Sigismund's reign quickly descended into a reign of terror, with mass executions becoming a chilling symbol of his cruelty. Every action he took, every decree he issued, was drenched in blood. The tyrant, now ruling with an iron fist, sought to quench his rage through brutal acts of violence, marking the beginning of a reign defined by fear and suffering. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. Sigismund of Hungary, once a leader of nobility, was not one to accept defeat with dignity. When the fateful Battle of Nicopolis unfolded in 1396, the weight of his failure was catastrophic. The Turkish Ottoman forces, led by Sultan Bayezid I, crushed the Christian coalition with ruthless precision. The forces Sigismund commanded, made up of Hungarians, French crusaders, and soldiers from other European nations, had no chance against the sheer might and tactical brilliance of the Ottomans. Sigismund himself barely escaped the carnage, his forces decimated and their morale shattered. He was left to pick through the wreckage of what was supposed to be a turning point for Christendom in its struggle against the Muslims. But rather than face this failure with humility or reflect on the losses suffered, Sigismund found himself consumed by a hatred so profound that it marked the beginning of a reign drenched in cruelty. Unable to bear the weight of his failure, Sigismund's mind twisted in turmoil. The shame of defeat gnawed at him, but instead of directing his wrath towards the Ottoman Empire, he chose to blame those who had fought beside him, the very French and Hungarian nobles whose fates had been sealed alongside his own. His pride and arrogance wouldn't allow him to accept any responsibility for the disaster. In the deep recesses of his shattered mind, he concocted a dark narrative where he was the victim, righteous king who had been betrayed by incompetent allies. The defeat had nothing to do with his lack of preparation, the poor strategies, or the disarray in his command. No, in his twisted view, the failure of Nicopolis lay squarely on the shoulders of those around him. The French knights, the Hungarian nobles, the soldiers under his banner, they were the ones who had failed him. They were the ones who had abandoned him to defeat. And now they would pay. With a rage that burned like wildfire, Sigismund returned to Hungary. His mind had already set on a singular path: retribution. He had seen firsthand the horrors of war and the bloodshed that came with it. Yet, his vengeance would not be the cold, calculated kind. It would be something far more terrifying. His need to punish the nobles who had failed him became an insatiable thirst, one that could never be quenched by mere executions. No, Sigismund sought to make them feel the full weight of his torment. His methods of punishment would echo the savage wrath of a man determined to obliterate all who had once stood beside him. Sigismund's reign of terror began immediately upon his return to Hungary. He ordered executions with a horrifying indifference, seeking not justice, but suffering. There were no trials, no defenses, no reprieve for those who fell under his suspicion. His rule became a chaotic nightmare where fear was the only law. The nobles, once confident in their power and their position within the kingdom, found themselves helpless before the king's bloodlust. In his eyes, their failure in Nicopolis was unforgivable, and they were to be punished not just for their incompetence, but for their very existence. The king's cruelty knew no bounds. It was not enough to simply execute them. Their deaths had to be a lesson for anyone who dared question his authority or loyalty. The king's punishments became a grotesque spectacle, a warning to the masses of what would happen if they too dared fail him. One of Sigismund's first acts upon his return was to round up the French nobles who had fought alongside him, those who had been caught in the disastrous retreat after the battle. They were stripped of their titles, their wealth, and their very humanity. What followed was a series of public executions that sent waves of horror throughout the kingdom. The French knights, once noble and proud, were subjected to horrific fates. Some were beheaded in a swift but brutal manner, but others were not granted such mercy. Sigismund delighted in their suffering, choosing to stretch out their deaths, savoring the fear and the agony in their eyes. His personal vendetta, driven by a twisted sense of betrayal, was reflected in the gruesome manner of execution he ordered. Some were impaled, left to die slowly, their bodies twisted in agony. Others were drawn and quartered, limbs torn from their bodies while they were still alive, their screams echoing through the palace halls. Sigismund watched it all, an impassive expression on his face, his heart cold and unfeeling. Sigismund's cruelty extended beyond the French nobles. He turned his wrath upon the Hungarian aristocracy as well, those who had once stood by his side, those who had pledged loyalty to him, but who he now saw as part of the betrayal that led to his catastrophic defeat. To them, he brought an equally horrifying fate. The Hungarian nobles were no longer men and women of high standing, but animals to be hunted and slaughtered for their perceived treachery. Sigismund's vengeance was not driven by any rational thought or strategic plan. It was the impulse of a man who had become consumed by rage, by a desire to make others feel the pain he had endured. His brutal retribution mirrored the savagery of war itself. He didn't just punish the guilty. He punished everyone, anyone he deemed responsible for his humiliation. They were all guilty in his eyes, and they would all suffer. The executions that took place in Hungary under Sigismund's rule were not the swift, dignified deaths of a just ruler, but grotesque spectacles meant to send a message to anyone who would dare defy him. These were not quick executions performed behind closed doors, but horrific public affairs where the bloodshed could be witnessed by all. Sigismund's rage needed an audience. He wanted his subjects to feel the terror that coursed through his veins, to understand that their lives hung by a thread, one that could be severed at any moment. Every death was a reminder of the king's unyielding wrath, and every drop of blood spilled was a testament to the dark path he had chosen. The executions were not only brutal in their execution, but also in their sheer numbers. Sigismund's thirst for vengeance knew no limits. He was not satisfied with executing a few of his perceived enemies. He wanted to strike fear into the heart of every nobleman who might think to challenge his authority. The killings became so frequent, so numerous, that the land itself seemed to be stained with the blood of Sigismund's enemies. Entire families were wiped out, their estates seized by the king, their names erased from history. Sigismund's cruelty left deep scars on the land, the people, and the kingdom. It was a reign defined not by wisdom or justice, but by a lust for power and a desire to make others suffer for his own failure. Sigismund's cruelty was not limited to his treatment of the nobility. It extended to the common people as well. The king's fearsome wrath did not spare those who dared speak out against him, those who whispered of his cruelty behind closed doors. He would have no dissent, no disobedience, and no criticism. Sigismund's terror ran so deep that even the most loyal subjects feared for their lives, unsure if they would be the next to feel the wrath of the tyrant king. The kingdom was plunged into a state of perpetual fear, where no one was safe from Sigismund's unpredictable cruelty. Nobles, peasants, and merchants alike lived in constant fear that their life would end in a brutal execution, their name dragged through the mud for a crime they may not even have committed. Sigismund's path of vengeance stretched across the land, and it would leave a trail of destruction in its wake. But the king was not content with the slaughter he had already unleashed. His obsession with retribution became a hunger that could never be satisfied, a thirst that no amount of blood could quench. He would continue to purge his kingdom of anyone who he believed had failed him, anyone who he could blame for the disaster at Nicopolis. His mind became so consumed by this obsession that it no longer mattered who fell under his sword. The vengeance he sought was now a game, a twisted form of entertainment that fed his ego and his need for control. Every execution, every death, only made him crave more, driving him deeper into madness and depravity. Sigismund's reign of terror would not end with the French and Hungarian nobility, but would extend to anyone who dared oppose him. His lust for revenge had turned him into something unrecognizable, a man who had once ruled with noble intentions, now reduced to a tyrant, a monster whose cruelty knew no bounds. The king who once stood tall in battle had become a beast, driven only by rage and vengeance. And in his wake, there would be nothing but suffering, fear, and the broken remnants of a kingdom that had once hoped for greatness. Sigismund's return to Hungary after the catastrophic defeat at Nicopolis was the beginning of a reign of terror that would stain the history of the kingdom for centuries. His soul, twisted by anger and humiliation, found only one outlet for its fury: blood. What followed was a gruesome spectacle of violence that was as much about public power as it was about private vengeance. Sigismund didn't simply punish those who had failed him. He made an example of them, using their deaths not only to satisfy his bloodlust but to send an unmistakable message to anyone who might dare to question his authority. These were not executions carried out with the cold efficiency of a monarch enforcing justice. They were brutal, public spectacles designed to evoke fear and ensure that no one would ever forget the price of defying him. The nobility, once powerful and untouchable, found themselves at the mercy of a tyrant who viewed their lives as little more than a means to further cement his control. Sigismund's acts of cruelty were not driven by a need for justice, but by a desire to wield power with absolute authority. Each execution he ordered, each noble he condemned, was a performance. It was theater, but the audience was the kingdom itself, and the punishment was as much about spectacle as it was about the target. Public executions became a frequent occurrence, and their purpose was to remind the people of the king's unyielding power. The executions were grand affairs, often held in the heart of the capital or in the towns where the nobles once held sway. They were designed to be seen, to be remembered, and to etch themselves into the collective consciousness of every subject in Hungary. Sigismund's desire for revenge was matched only by his thirst for control, and the public bloodletting that followed his return to power was a stark reflection of both. The victims of Sigismund's wrath were not executed in the clean, efficient manner one might expect from a ruler of his stature. There was no mercy for them, no quick end to their suffering. Instead, they were subjected to horrors that could only be described as grotesque. Sigismund believed that a death should serve as a warning, and he orchestrated these executions as if they were choreographed dances of death. The nobility who had once been the pillars of the kingdom found themselves dragged through the streets in chains, their dignity stripped away as they were paraded before the people. These were men and women who had once enjoyed wealth, power, and status. Now, they were nothing more than victims in the king's sickening game of dominance. Some of them were hung, but not simply to die. Sigismund had them strung up in public squares, their bodies left to dangle for hours, a grotesque reminder of what happened to those who crossed him. The stench of death would fill the air, the bodies swaying gently in the wind as the crowd looked on in stunned silence. This was no simple punishment. It was a public display, a message that Sigismund's rule was absolute, and that disobedience, no matter the form, would not be tolerated. But Sigismund's cruelty didn't stop at mere executions. He relished in inflicting suffering upon his victims in ways that defied the boundaries of human decency. Some of the nobles he sentenced to death were drawn and quartered. Their limbs were torn from their bodies, their blood spilled on the ground as they writhed in agony, their faces contorted in pain. Others were tortured before they were killed. Sigismund would have them beaten, whipped, or mutilated in front of the watching crowd, the sounds of their suffering carrying across the square as the king looked on with cold indifference. The brutality of these punishments was not an accident. They were calculated to break the spirits of any who might have once dared defy Sigismund. The message was clear. Power was no longer something earned or held through noble birth. It was something to be claimed by force, and those who could not survive Sigismund's wrath would never have a place in his kingdom. The king's cruelty became legendary, and every new execution was a reminder that he could and would destroy anyone who crossed him. The public executions weren't just about punishment. They were about consolidation of power. Sigismund understood that to rule with absolute authority, he needed to eradicate any threat to his reign. This was not only a matter of revenge. It was about securing his position at the top of the kingdom's hierarchy. The nobility had always been a powerful force in Hungary, and Sigismund, though king, had to ensure that he alone was the ultimate source of authority. The nobles who had once held sway over the land were now enemies in his eyes, and their death was not just a personal vendetta, but a political maneuver to prevent any potential rivals from emerging. By eliminating them, he ensured that the power he held was unchallenged. His brutality was not just about retribution. It was a strategic decision designed to strike fear into the hearts of his subjects, particularly those with enough influence or wealth to threaten his rule. Sigismund's political calculations were cold and ruthless. He understood that to rule effectively, he had to weaken the very foundation of Hungarian nobility. By cutting down those who had once been his allies, Sigismund sent a clear message. Loyalty to the king was no longer a matter of respect or tradition, but of absolute obedience. Those who had once been his peers, who had stood beside him in battle, were now nothing more than obstacles to his power. He dismantled the structure of the Hungarian aristocracy, removing those who had the means and the ambition to challenge him. In doing so, Sigismund turned Hungary from a kingdom of noble families into a kingdom ruled by one man, a tyrant who had no equal. His cruelty, though terrifying, was effective. The once strong nobility, reduced to ashes, no longer had the power to oppose him, and his rule, though based in fear, was secure. Sigismund's massacres of the nobility were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger strategy to control the political landscape of Hungary. As he eliminated the old aristocracy, he also ensured that those who remained loyal to him were too afraid to challenge his authority. The fear he instilled in his subjects worked in his favor, ensuring that any who might have opposed him were silenced, either by death or by the terror of knowing what awaited them should they step out of line. It was a vicious cycle that Sigismund cultivated, one in which loyalty could only be achieved through fear. As the bodies of his former allies piled up, Sigismund grew stronger, more certain of his power. He began to believe that he was invincible, a king who had ascended beyond mere mortal concerns and had become a god in his own right. The political ramifications of Sigismund's reign were far-reaching. His purges of the nobility ensured that no one would ever challenge his rule, but they also left Hungary in a state of chaos. The once proud noble families were no more, their estates abandoned or seized by the king, their lands left to rot or fall under the control of Sigismund's loyalists. The kingdom, once a sprawling network of interwoven alliances and power structures, was now a kingdom of fear and distrust. The common people, those who had no stake in the noble family's intrigues, suffered as well. The lands that had once been fertile under the care of the noble classes were now neglected, and the peasants who worked them were left to starve or flee from the violence that Sigismund had unleashed. The kingdom that had once been a thriving center of trade and agriculture became a desolate place, haunted by the memory of its former glory and the unrelenting cruelty of the king who had brought it to its knees. Sigismund's massacre of the nobility was a grim reminder of the price of power. His cruelty was not just a means of punishing those who had wronged him. It was a tool for reshaping Hungary in his own image. He believed that by eliminating the old guard, he could create a new, more obedient order, one where the only loyalty that mattered was loyalty to him. But in the end, his reign of terror did not bring peace or stability to Hungary. It brought only destruction, chaos, and a kingdom in ruins. The nobility that had once upheld the kingdom's grandeur was gone, and in their place stood only a frightened, fractured people, trembling under the shadow of a tyrant king who ruled through fear and blood. Sigismund's reign, which began with the brutal massacre of the nobility, would continue its dark trajectory into a period marked by the rise of a tyrant unlike any other. The bloodshed he unleashed was not merely a reflection of his rage or a desperate attempt at revenge. It was part of a calculated, terrifying strategy to seize absolute control over Hungary. His ability to manipulate the fear he instilled in his subjects would prove to be his most effective tool in securing his place at the throne, for even as the bodies of the nobility piled high, Sigismund's grip on power tightened with an iron fist. Fear became the currency with which he purchased loyalty, and terror was the chain with which he bound his kingdom. Sigismund, once a prince with potential, had transformed into something far more sinister, a monster consumed by an unrelenting desire to maintain control and willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to ensure his reign. The people of Hungary, ordinary men and women who had little stake in the grand political games of the nobility, soon found themselves swept up in a tide of dread. The very air of the kingdom seemed thick with fear, as Sigismund's presence became synonymous with death and destruction. The nobles, who once enjoyed privileges and power, had been reduced to mere whispers in the wind, their influence shattered by the king's bloody purges. But while the nobility had been decimated, the common folk, the peasantry, and the lower classes, who had never held much power to begin with, were now caught in the terrifying wake of Sigismund's rise to absolute authority. Sigismund had learned the most important lesson of all. A king's power is not just built on armies or wealth, but on the hearts and minds of the people. And through manipulation, fear, and intimidation, he transformed himself into an omnipotent figure that his subjects could neither defy nor escape. Sigismund's ruthlessness was not limited to the cold execution of his enemies. It extended to the way he handled the masses, the people who could either serve as a tool to further his reign or become an obstacle to his rule. Despite the horrific violence he had unleashed, Sigismund knew that to maintain his power, he needed the support, or at the very least, the obedience, of the population. He understood that the true power of a ruler lies not just in the terror he inflicts on his enemies, but in the quiet submission he forces from those who serve him. And so, Sigismund's manipulation of fear began in earnest, turning the populace into his unwitting accomplices in his cruel ascent to the pinnacle of power. Fear, in his mind, was the most effective weapon of all, because it worked on a level deeper than simple obedience. It was something that lived within the soul, something that could not be easily escaped. The king's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He used the blood of the nobility to demonstrate his power, then forced the people to watch. The executions, brutal and unrelenting, became a regular feature of public life. They were not simply about punishing the guilty, but about making the entire population aware of the price they would pay for crossing Sigismund. At first, it may have seemed like a one-time spectacle, a king, scorned and humiliated by defeat, taking revenge on those who had failed him. But as the executions continued, and as the bodies of the once powerful were displayed for all to see, it became clear that this was not just retribution. It was a deliberate tactic to instill fear. The people saw these horrors not as isolated events, but as part of an ongoing campaign of intimidation. With each death, the fear of Sigismund grew deeper, his presence looming over every corner of the kingdom like a shadow that could not be outrun. Sigismund was a master of psychological warfare. His manipulation of fear went beyond the bloodshed. It was in the way he wielded his power, using it to create an atmosphere where his subjects were constantly on edge, unable to predict when they too might fall victim to his wrath. The common people, who had once lived their lives in relative peace, now found themselves subject to the whims of a king who had no regard for their lives. There were whispers of people being hauled off in the dead of night, never to be seen again. Rumors swirled about executions carried out without warning, entire villages being razed for the slightest infraction. Sigismund's regime was marked not just by the public executions of the nobility, but by the silent, hidden terror that gripped every man, woman, and child in Hungary. The king's grip on the people was absolute, because he had made them believe that to resist him would mean certain death. The fear of what might happen next was enough to keep the population in line, paralyzed by the sheer scale of his cruelty. But fear alone was not enough. Sigismund knew that to maintain his power, he needed to ensure that no one, no noble, no general, no commoner, could challenge his authority. His political calculations were cold and precise. Every action he took, every decree he issued, was aimed at eliminating any potential threat to his reign. His cruelty, though staggering, was not mindless. It was calculated, a means to an end. He had learned that the greatest threat to a tyrant is not just rebellion, but the idea of rebellion itself. Therefore, Sigismund did everything in his power to destroy any chance of opposition before it could take root. He manipulated alliances, sowed distrust among his enemies, and eliminated anyone who might have the resources or the ambition to challenge his absolute control. Sigismund's political ruthlessness extended beyond simple execution. It was woven into the very fabric of his governance. He became a master of divide and conquer, pitting factions against one another to ensure that no single group could unite against him. He understood that a kingdom held together by fear and division would be much easier to control than one united under a common cause. He used his knowledge of human nature to turn every situation to his advantage, always keeping potential threats at arm's length, never allowing them the space to grow. Anyone who posed a challenge to his authority, whether through political maneuvering or military might, was swiftly crushed. Sigismund's methods were not confined to the battlefield. He also waged a war of intelligence, using spies and informants to root out any hint of dissent before it could spread. His kingdom was a network of secrets, whispers, and shadows, where every corner seemed to hold the potential for betrayal. His political cruelty was evident in how he manipulated his own court. There was no room for loyalty in Sigismund's court, only obedience. Nobles, once proud and influential, were reduced to sycophants, terrified of losing favor with the king. His control was absolute, and he ensured that no one ever rose above him. Even his closest advisors were subject to the king's whims, never knowing if they would be next in line for punishment. Sigismund used his power to keep them on edge, forcing them to prove their loyalty time and time again. Any hint of disloyalty, whether real or imagined, was met with swift retribution. His court became a place of paranoia, where no one trusted anyone, and everyone feared the king. The idea of trust was eradicated, replaced by a single, overarching truth. Sigismund could not be challenged, and to challenge him was to face certain destruction. The kingdom itself was reshaped under Sigismund's rule. Where there was once a thriving, diverse society, now there was a land divided and broken, a place where fear was the currency of power. The nobility, once the backbone of Hungary, was decimated, replaced by a new class of loyalists who owed everything to the king and were too terrified to ever defy him. The common people, who had once been free to live their lives with some degree of autonomy, were now reduced to servitude, their every movement watched by the king's spies. Sigismund's kingdom was a place where there was no room for dissent, no place for rebellion, and no hope for the future. It was a land of shadows, where even the most innocent could be caught in the king's web of fear and cruelty. But Sigismund's ruthlessness was not limited to the kingdom's external politics. It was also evident in his foreign relations. The king's need to maintain control extended beyond his own borders, and he used his power to manipulate alliances and destroy potential enemies on the international stage. He became a master of diplomacy, though his diplomacy was one of deceit, coercion, and brutality. Sigismund knew that to keep his throne secure, he had to secure his place in Europe, and he did so by playing countries off against one another. He manipulated rival kingdoms, sowed discord between powerful leaders, and used his own military might to strike fear into the hearts of those who might seek to challenge him. His reputation as a tyrant was well known across Europe, and many kings, though they feared him, were too wary to engage with him directly. Sigismund's cruelty extended beyond his borders, ensuring that his empire was both feared and respected. Sigismund's rise to power was the rise of a monster, a king who had mastered the art of terror and used it to manipulate both his own people and the world around him. His cruelty knew no bounds, and his desire for absolute control consumed everything in its path. Hungary, under Sigismund's reign, became a kingdom where fear ruled, where loyalty was demanded at the point of a sword, and where the king's will was the only law that mattered. His rise was not the rise of a noble ruler, but the rise of a monster who had destroyed everything in his quest for power. And as Sigismund continued to tighten his grip on Hungary, the shadows of his kingdom grew ever darker. Sigismund's thirst for power and control knew no limits. His reign, already marked by savage purges and brutal executions, reached a new and horrifying height with the introduction of what would become his signature form of punishment, the infamous dragon's spine. It was not merely an execution. It was a grotesque, symbolic act designed to strike terror into the hearts of anyone who dared defy him. The punishment, conceived in the darkest recesses of Sigismund's mind, was as much a tool of psychological warfare as it was a physical torment. It was a form of brutality so severe that it became a living nightmare for all who witnessed it. No one was safe from the king's cruelty, and the dragon's spine became an unmistakable reminder that disobedience would not be tolerated. The very mention of the punishment sent shivers down the spines of his subjects, as they knew that to fall into Sigismund's hands meant to endure the unimaginable. The execution, as horrifying as it was, began with the victim being bound and dragged through the streets of the city. Their fate was sealed before they even arrived at the city gates. There was no trial, no semblance of justice, just the king's wrath, and it was all-consuming. The victim was forced to kneel before the executioner, who, under Sigismund's orders, would perform the horrific procedure. The victim's spine, the very core of their being, would be ripped out from their body in a brutal and savage manner. This act, though gruesome in its own right, was only the beginning of the terror. The victim's body, now grotesquely mutilated, was strung up on the city gates, left to dangle as a public display for all to see. Their blood, still dripping from their body, stained the ground beneath them, the life of the victim extinguished in the most horrific way imaginable. The mutilated corpse remained on display for days, slowly decomposing as a grisly monument to Sigismund's power. The very nature of the dragon's spine punishment was designed to maximize pain, suffering, and humiliation. Sigismund knew that the physical pain of such an execution was only part of the equation. The psychological torment was just as important, if not more so. The sight of the victim, their body hanging limply, their insides torn out and left exposed for all to see, was a powerful visual cue. It was a spectacle that could not be ignored. The people, powerless to intervene or challenge the king's authority, were left to witness this atrocity as a reminder of the price they would pay for disobedience. It was a punishment that transcended mere death. It was a public act of dominance, a display of Sigismund's utter control over life and death. The victim's suffering was not just about punishment. It was about ensuring that no one would ever forget the lengths to which Sigismund would go to maintain his rule. The execution was not just a one-time event. It became a regular occurrence during Sigismund's reign. The gates of the city became the setting for countless dragon's spine executions, each one more brutal and terrifying than the last. The punishment itself became a symbol of Sigismund's cruelty, a tool he wielded to remind his subjects that their lives were entirely at the mercy of his whims. Each time the victim's body was hung from the gates, it was a clear message to anyone who might think to challenge the king's authority. Defiance would be met with the most unimaginable horrors. And the psychological terror this caused was profound. The people of Hungary lived in constant fear, always aware that any slight or act of resistance could lead to their own gruesome end. The dragon's spine became the ultimate deterrent, ensuring that even the slightest disobedience would be punished in the most horrific way. But the psychological impact of the dragon's spine was not limited to the people who witnessed it. It was also an essential tool in Sigismund's campaign to instill fear in his own court. His noblemen, once proud and powerful, now cowered before him. The sight of the bodies hanging from the gates sent a clear message to those who might harbor thoughts of rebellion. Sigismund was not a king who would tolerate disloyalty, and his punishments were designed to leave no room for doubt. The nobility, once the heart of Hungarian power, found themselves reduced to mere puppets, their strings pulled by the unrelenting force of the king's cruelty. The fear of suffering the same fate as those on the gates kept them in line, ensuring that no one would dare to oppose Sigismund's iron rule. Even those closest to him, those who might have once dared to question his decisions, now found themselves paralyzed by the fear of becoming the next victim of the dragon's spine. The psychological warfare Sigismund waged through this punishment was unparalleled. It was not enough to simply execute his enemies. He sought to break their spirit, to destroy any hope they might have had for mercy or reprieve. The terror that Sigismund instilled in his subjects was not just the result of the brutal executions themselves, but of the knowledge that they could be next. The victims of the dragon's spine were not only physically destroyed, but their dignity was obliterated. Their bodies, left exposed for days in a public square, became a symbol of the king's ultimate authority. The execution was a violent act of domination, a way for Sigismund to assert his power over life and death. It was a statement that no one was beyond his reach, and that defiance, no matter how small, would be met with swift and brutal retribution. For Sigismund, the dragon's spine punishment was more than just an execution. It was an art form, a tool of psychological manipulation that allowed him to keep his kingdom in check. He knew that fear was the most powerful force in the world, and he used it to bend the people to his will. By subjecting his victims to the most unimaginable pain and torment, Sigismund ensured that no one would ever question his authority again. The executions became a performance, a display of power designed to send a message to anyone who might consider challenging him. The bodies of the victims hanging from the gates were not just corpses. They were symbols, warnings to anyone who might think to resist. The terror they evoked was not fleeting. It lasted long after the bodies had rotted and the execution had passed into history. The very mention of the dragon's spine was enough to send a chill through the hearts of Sigismund's subjects, for they knew that the punishment could fall on them at any moment. But Sigismund's cruelty did not stop with the execution itself. He reveled in the fear and suffering of others, using the dragon's spine as a tool of control not only over his enemies, but also over his own subjects. The sight of the bodies hanging on the gates was a constant reminder that Sigismund was the ultimate power in Hungary, and that anyone who dared defy him would pay a terrible price. The people had no choice but to obey, for disobedience was met with unspeakable horrors. The fear that Sigismund generated became so pervasive that it seeped into every corner of society, ensuring that no one was safe from his wrath. The common people, the nobility, and even Sigismund's own court lived in a state of constant dread, knowing that the slightest misstep could lead to the most brutal and humiliating death imaginable. The dragon's spine punishment became Sigismund's legacy, a symbol of his unrelenting cruelty and absolute power. It was an execution that transcended the physical act of killing. It was an act of domination, a way for the king to remind everyone of the complete and utter control he had over life and death. The victims of the punishment were not just destroyed physically, but psychologically as well. Their bodies were mutilated and left exposed as a message to the kingdom. Defy Sigismund, and you will suffer unimaginable consequences. The terror that this punishment inspired was all-encompassing, ensuring that no one would ever challenge the king's reign. Sigismund's rule was built on fear, and the dragon's spine was the tool he used to keep that fear alive in the hearts of all who lived under his tyrannical rule. It was a punishment so horrific that it became synonymous with his name, a dark mark on the history of Hungary that would never be erased. Sigismund's reign, already drenched in blood and soaked with cruelty, reached a new level of grotesque irony when he self-proclaimed himself the savior of Christianity. This title, laden with religious connotations, seemed almost laughable when juxtaposed with the tyrannical actions he perpetrated against his own people and enemies alike. Sigismund's brutality knew no bounds, as he ruthlessly murdered nobles, eliminated threats, and executed his own allies with the grotesque spectacle of the dragon's spine. Despite this unrelenting violence, he cloaked his actions in the guise of piety and religious duty, positioning himself as the protector of the Christian faith. It was a facade, one so transparently hypocritical that it could only be seen as a manipulation of the faith itself, a tool for controlling the masses and justifying his tyranny. The king, who had shown no mercy to those who crossed him, now sought to position himself as a beacon of righteousness, a stark contrast to the dark reality of his reign. Sigismund's claims to be the protector of Christianity were, at their core, an exercise in political manipulation. The title he so proudly proclaimed allowed him to claim divine right, an unshakable moral authority, and the unquestioned support of the Church. He took advantage of the deep religious sentiment of the time, knowing that by positioning himself as the defender of the faith, he could gain the loyalty of both the common people and the powerful religious figures in his court. It was an act that transformed him from a mere king into a crusader, a man on a divine mission, charged with defending Christendom from its enemies. His brutality was thus hidden behind the comforting veneer of religious zealotry, allowing him to continue his tyrannical rule under the pretense of doing God's will. The people, many of whom were living in fear of his bloody reign, found it difficult to reconcile the king's horrific actions with his self-proclaimed status as a holy defender. Yet, because religion was such a powerful force at the time, Sigismund's claim managed to hold sway over many. Sigismund's self-declared title as the savior of Christianity did not come from a place of genuine faith. It was instead an opportunistic ploy to solidify his power and control. His actions, far from reflecting the values of Christianity, betrayed them completely. Christianity, at its core, teaches mercy, humility, and love for one's neighbor, yet Sigismund's reign was built on fear, violence, and brutality. He tore apart families, wiped out entire noble families, and subjected his subjects to horrifying punishments, all while presenting himself as a defender of Christian values. The irony of his title, therefore, lies in the stark contrast between the cruelty he inflicted upon others and the moral righteousness he claimed to embody. It was an ironic farce, a king who used religion not as a guide for his actions, but as a tool to mask the dark and twisted nature of his rule. In the medieval world, religious authority was a powerful weapon, and Sigismund wielded it with calculated precision. His actions were in direct opposition to the principles of Christian teaching, yet he invoked the name of God to justify his reign. His brutal massacres, like the execution of nobles and the horrifying dragon's spine punishment, were not the actions of a man who sought to protect the faith, but of a man who sought only to maintain and expand his power. Yet, by casting himself as a religious figure, Sigismund hoped to inoculate himself against criticism and rebellion. The hypocrisy of his actions could be easily overlooked by those too fearful or too devout to question the divine authority he claimed. The contradiction between his ruthless political calculations and his religious self-image only deepened the darkness of his character, revealing a man who saw his own desires and ambitions as more important than the very teachings of the faith he claimed to defend. One of the most egregious aspects of Sigismund's manipulation of Christianity was his involvement in the Crusades. He portrayed himself as a noble leader fighting to protect Christendom, a defender of the faith against the forces of Islam. Yet, his actions in the name of religion were far from virtuous. His decisions to launch military campaigns were not motivated by any divine calling, but rather by political calculation and personal gain. Sigismund's involvement in the Crusades was a means of bolstering his power, gaining prestige, and further solidifying his control over Hungary. While he presented himself as a Christian knight, fighting for God's will, his motivations were as secular as any king's. The religious fervor he invoked was nothing more than a facade, a carefully constructed image designed to win him favor with both the church and the people. Sigismund's involvement in the Crusades also highlights the profound disconnect between his religious claims and his brutal actions. While he was willing to send soldiers to die in the name of Christianity, he was equally willing to slaughter his own people without remorse. His reign was defined by an almost pathological need for control, and his political maneuvers were often cloaked in the language of religion. Yet, there was no semblance of the Christian compassion that should have defined a ruler's actions. His cruelty towards his own people, his merciless execution of rivals, and his callous disregard for human life were completely at odds with the principles of Christianity. And yet, Sigismund continued to parade himself as the savior of the faith, manipulating the language of Christianity to mask his true nature. The irony of Sigismund's title as the savior of Christianity deepened as his reign wore on. His actions, once justified by religious pretensions, became increasingly divorced from any sense of divine will. His brutality was so intense, so widespread, that it seemed almost absurd that he could still present himself as a defender of Christianity. Yet he persisted in his claims, knowing that the label of savior would protect him from any significant resistance. The very title he assumed, intended to elevate him to the level of a religious hero, only served to deepen his hypocrisy. The contrast between the king's actions and the religion he invoked was so stark that it became impossible to view him as anything but a monstrous figure, willing to use any means, no matter how blood-soaked, to maintain his power. Sigismund's self-proclaimed title was not just a matter of political manipulation. It was a reflection of his deep-seated need for validation and legitimacy. By framing his reign as part of a divine mission, he sought to make his brutality seem justified, even noble. But in reality, his religious posturing only served to make his cruelty more apparent. The hypocrisy of his actions became more glaring with each new atrocity. His title as savior of Christianity was a hollow one, a title held by a man whose actions were anything but Christian. The stark contrast between the supposed savior of the faith and the tyrant king who reveled in the suffering of others only served to highlight the depth of his moral corruption. Sigismund's manipulation of religion did not end with his self-declared title. He used the church as an instrument of his power, bending religious leaders to his will and ensuring that his reign would be legitimized by the highest authorities in Christendom. He used the power of the clergy to secure his position, aligning himself with the church to enhance his reputation and shield himself from criticism. The church, in turn, offered Sigismund its blessing, not out of genuine admiration for his faith or morality, but because his power was indispensable. It was a marriage of convenience, a political alliance that allowed both Sigismund and the church to further their own interests. By aligning himself with the Christian faith, Sigismund not only cemented his power, but he also ensured that any who dared challenge him would be seen as enemies of God, and thus enemies of the people. The religious manipulation that Sigismund engaged in also had the effect of creating a powerful myth around his reign. As the so-called protector of Christianity, he was able to craft a narrative in which his actions were seen as divinely sanctioned, a twisted mirror image of the great crusaders of the past. He portrayed himself as a defender of the faith, a king chosen by God to lead the Christian world to victory. But this image was purely fabricated. Sigismund's true motivations, driven by a desire for power, wealth, and control, were far removed from any notion of Christian virtue. His hypocrisy, cloaked in the robes of religion, was so vast that it became a central pillar of his reign. A reign that, for all its religious pretensions, was defined by brutality, fear, and bloodshed. In the end, Sigismund's self-proclaimed title as the savior of Christianity became a bitter mockery of the very religion he claimed to defend. His actions, which betrayed the values of Christianity at every turn, only served to highlight the depth of his hypocrisy. The king who branded himself the protector of the faith was, in reality, a tyrant who used religion as a tool for political gain. Sigismund's reign, steeped in cruelty and bloodshed, stands as a testament to the dangers of religious manipulation and to the darkness that can arise when a ruler uses faith as a shield for his own brutal ambitions. His title, far from ennobling him, only served to expose the monstrous reality beneath the facade of a self-proclaimed savior. Sigismund's rule was defined by violence and cruelty, but his most daring and audacious move came not on the battlefield, but in his defiance of the Pope and the Church. Throughout history, the Church had held immense sway over the political affairs of Europe, and to defy it was to challenge the very foundations of Christendom. However, Sigismund, emboldened by his unyielding ambition and thirst for power, dared to reject the authority of the papacy. This defiance was not born of a noble desire to reform the church or correct perceived injustices. It was simply a reflection of his unrelenting desire to rule without constraints. The Pope, seeing Sigismund's actions as an affront to both divine law and moral order, excommunicated him, condemning him for his cruelty, his self-proclaimed title as the savior of Christianity, and his bloody reign. But rather than repent or seek to reconcile, Sigismund stood firm in his defiance, pushing forward with his tyrannical agenda. Sigismund's rejection of papal authority was not a singular moment, but a deliberate stance that defined much of his reign. The Pope, as the spiritual leader of Christendom, held significant power, and his condemnation was a blow that would have destroyed most rulers. But for Sigismund, the Pope's wrath was just another obstacle to overcome. His belief in his own divinity and his ability to manipulate the power structures around him left him with little fear of the Church's condemnation. He continued to wage war with a ferocity that seemed to be fueled, in part, by his need to assert his dominance over not just his military enemies, but the very institutions that governed Europe. Sigismund's disregard for the Pope's authority was not just a religious matter, it was a political statement. He refused to be bound by the moral constraints that the Church sought to impose on him. His ruthless pursuit of power, unchecked by the Church's authority, allowed him to act with impunity, killing, maiming, and executing without fear of reprisal from religious institutions. This defiance, however, did not come without consequences. As the Pope's condemnation spread throughout Europe, it became clear that Sigismund's rejection of papal authority had alienated him from potential allies and diminished his standing among the ruling elites of Christendom. The Church, an institution that had long been the linchpin of European diplomacy, now saw Sigismund as an enemy of the faith. His title as the savior of Christianity became a cruel joke in the eyes of many, for how could a man who defied the Pope and killed with such brutality claim to be the defender of the Christian faith? His rejection of papal authority not only tarnished his image, but also made him a pariah among European rulers. The Pope's excommunication meant that Sigismund was no longer seen as a legitimate ruler by many of Europe's monarchs and nobles, who viewed papal approval as essential for maintaining their authority. The political fallout from Sigismund's defiance of the Church was swift and severe. His rejection by the Pope placed him at odds with many of Europe's most powerful kingdoms and noble families. The Pope's influence over Christendom was immense, and his condemnation of Sigismund reverberated across the continent. Kings and princes who had once viewed Sigismund as a potential ally or a useful political partner now distanced themselves from him, unwilling to be associated with a man who had defied the moral and religious authority of the Church. Sigismund's refusal to reconcile with the Pope meant that he lost the support of many who could have bolstered his position, both militarily and diplomatically. European rulers, who had long been wary of Sigismund's ruthlessness, now had a convenient excuse to turn their backs on him. They saw the Pope's condemnation as a signal that Sigismund was beyond redemption, a tyrant who had placed himself outside the bounds of civilization and Christian morality. Sigismund's rejection of the Church also had a profound impact on his relationship with the common people of Hungary and beyond. The Church was, for many, the only source of moral authority and the only institution capable of offering a sense of justice and legitimacy. Sigismund's blatant disregard for papal authority made him a figure of revulsion for those who looked to the Church as a guiding force in their lives. His violent and oppressive rule, coupled with his self-proclaimed title as the savior of Christianity, was a contradiction that could not be ignored. The common people, who had already suffered under his cruelty, now saw him as not only a tyrant but a heretic, someone who had turned his back on the very foundation of their faith. The Church's rejection of Sigismund painted him as a ruler who had chosen to place himself above both God and man, and this perception only deepened the already widespread animosity toward him. But for Sigismund, the political consequences of his defiance were not just about losing allies or tarnishing his image. The rejection by the Church was a direct threat to his authority and control. As the Pope's condemnation spread, Sigismund found himself in an increasingly isolated position, unable to secure the religious legitimacy that was crucial for any European monarch of the time. The loss of papal support meant that Sigismund's rule was now under constant threat. Without the Church's blessing, he had no divine mandate to justify his actions. His claim to power, once reinforced by religious authority, was now weakened, and the people, even those who had once feared him, began to question whether his reign was legitimate. The Pope's excommunication, while it failed to immediately depose Sigismund, was a powerful weapon that undermined his rule, sowing discord and discontent throughout the realm. The consequences of Sigismund's defiance of the Pope were not confined to Hungary alone. His rejection of papal authority resonated throughout Europe, causing significant political rifts. The Pope's condemnation of Sigismund was not simply an internal religious matter. It was a signal to other European powers that Sigismund was no longer a ruler to be supported or trusted. Europe's power dynamics were deeply influenced by the Church, and Sigismund's alienation from the papacy meant that he was now politically vulnerable. Other kingdoms, seeing the Pope's open condemnation, saw an opportunity to weaken Sigismund's influence and diminish his power. The political consequences of his defiance rippled out across the continent, turning potential allies into enemies and transforming what might have been a temporary political setback into a permanent fracture in his relations with Europe's aristocracy and ruling elite. Sigismund's rejection by the Church also placed him at odds with the very religious forces that had once helped secure his legitimacy. The Church had long been a powerful force in medieval Europe, not just as a spiritual institution, but as a political one as well. Kings and princes relied on the Church for support, both in terms of legitimacy and military assistance. To defy the Pope was to risk the loss of everything that had once given a monarch credibility. Sigismund, however, had chosen to ignore these considerations in favor of his own tyrannical agenda. His rejection of the Church was not just a personal act of defiance. It was a political gamble that would ultimately alienate him from the wider European community. The Pope's condemnation, far from being a temporary setback, marked the beginning of Sigismund's downfall as a respected political figure. As Sigismund's reign continued, the political consequences of his rejection by the Pope grew ever more apparent. His military campaigns, once seen as part of a larger Christian struggle against the Ottomans and other external enemies, were now viewed with suspicion by his fellow rulers. They saw Sigismund's actions not as the deeds of a noble monarch, but as the desperate acts of a tyrant who had placed his own ambitions above the needs of his people and the teachings of Christianity. The Pope's condemnation of Sigismund made it difficult for him to forge alliances with other European rulers, who saw the excommunication as a sign of his inability to maintain control over his own kingdom, let alone lead a crusade or expand his power. The political fallout from his defiance of the Church rendered him a pariah, a king without allies and without the moral and political legitimacy that could have strengthened his rule. Sigismund's rejection by the Pope and the Church ultimately had a profound impact on his rule and legacy. His defiance of papal authority, which may have seemed like an act of strength at the time, only exposed the deeper cracks in his reign. His political isolation, the loss of support from the religious institutions that had once backed him, and the tarnishing of his reputation across Europe sealed his fate. The very actions that Sigismund believed would solidify his power only alienated him from those who could have helped him maintain it. His rejection of the Pope, rather than marking a new era of defiance and strength, set into motion the unraveling of his political power and left him vulnerable to enemies both within and outside his kingdom. In the end, Sigismund's defiance of the Church was not a display of strength, but of hubris, a fateful decision that would echo through the halls of history as a symbol of his downfall. Sigismund's ambition had always been boundless, and he saw the crusade as the ultimate vehicle to assert his power, both within Hungary and across Europe. After his crushing defeat at the Battle of Nicopolis, where his forces were annihilated by the Ottoman Empire, Sigismund refused to accept the bitter truth of his failure. Instead of retreating into self-reflection or reconsidering his approach, he doubled down, continuing his military campaigns against the Ottomans as if to prove to the world, and to himself, that he was still the protector of Christendom, the so-called savior of Christianity, in whom divine favor flowed freely. His refusal to accept defeat and his hubris led him down a dark path, one where his continued military failures would only deepen his cruelty and exacerbate the suffering of his people. Despite his belief in his own invincibility, the relentless cycle of failure and defeat became a harsh mirror to his inability to lead, eventually marking the beginning of his inevitable downfall. Sigismund's continued push against the Ottomans was both a political and religious maneuver. He believed that by leading the charge against the Islamic forces, he could restore his honor, rally the people of Hungary around his banner, and regain favor among European monarchs and the Church. The Crusades, after all, were seen as a holy mission, a righteous war in defense of Christianity, and Sigismund believed that his role in leading it would not only solidify his power, but also elevate him to the level of the great crusading kings and knights of the past. It was a delusional mission, one that disregarded the practical realities of warfare and the overwhelming military superiority of the Ottomans. Yet, driven by a desire for personal redemption and the need to prove his worthiness, Sigismund continued to push forward, with each failure compounding the last, as if his persistence alone could rewrite history. Sigismund's crusade was marked by the same toxic mixture of hubris and arrogance that had fueled his earlier decisions. Ignoring the lessons of his past failures, he threw himself into battle with all the fervor of a man convinced of his divine right to rule, convinced that God's favor was his due. He saw the Ottomans as an enemy to be vanquished, but in reality, he was ill-prepared to face the formidable forces of Sultan Bayezid I and the Ottomans, who had already proven their military prowess. The Crusades, particularly the failed expedition of Nicopolis, had already shown Sigismund's lack of strategic vision, but his overwhelming pride and stubbornness prevented him from acknowledging that his forces were simply not capable of matching the Ottomans in battle. His men were exhausted from years of war, and morale was low. But Sigismund, blind to his own failings, believed that persistence alone could overcome the odds. He continued to press forward with new campaigns, leading his army into battle time, and again with no clear strategy, no reinforcements, and no hope for success. This refusal to accept defeat led to the disintegration of Sigismund's authority and control. His stubbornness in pursuing a war that was already lost led him to overextend his resources, sending more men to die in futile battles against a relentless foe. The cost of the crusade, both in terms of lives and resources, was enormous, but Sigismund's ego could not be tempered by reason. He saw himself not as a king with a responsibility to his people, but as a martyr for the cause of Christendom, a man who had been chosen by God to lead the fight against the Ottomans. His delusion became a destructive force, as he continued to feed his army into the jaws of failure. Sigismund's soldiers fought and died, their bodies scattered across battlefields that offered no hope of victory, while he stubbornly clung to the belief that his cause was divinely sanctioned and would eventually succeed. But the more he pushed, the more futile his efforts became. His stubbornness in the face of failure only compounded the devastation. Despite his clear failure, Sigismund refused to alter his approach or even admit that his military strategy had been flawed. Instead of retreating and regrouping, he insisted on fighting battles he could not win, sending his men into slaughter without consideration for their lives or the greater good. His pride was his downfall, as he believed that his continued push against the Ottomans would eventually secure victory, even though the situation became increasingly untenable. His refusal to admit his mistakes not only doomed his military campaigns, but also worsened the situation for the common people of Hungary, who were left to bear the brunt of the consequences. Sigismund's stubbornness meant that resources that could have been used to protect the kingdom or rebuild after his earlier defeats were instead poured into a never-ending war that brought nothing but death and suffering. The people who had once looked to him as their protector now began to see him as a reckless and dangerous ruler, someone who cared more about his own pride than the welfare of his kingdom. As his military campaigns faltered, Sigismund's reputation among his allies began to crumble. The failure of his crusades tarnished his image across Europe, where he had once been seen as a defender of Christendom. The European powers, many of whom had once supported Sigismund's cause or viewed him as a potential ally, now saw him as a liability. His failure to achieve any lasting victories against the Ottomans undermined his authority and credibility as a leader. His political capital, already weakened by his rejection of the Pope and the Church, was now spent. The noble families in Hungary, many of whom had supported Sigismund in his early years, began to turn away from him as his military failures became undeniable. The promise of victory and glory, once associated with his leadership, now seemed hollow and false. The grand plans for the expansion of his kingdom were overshadowed by the growing recognition that Sigismund was not the strong, victorious king he had once claimed to be, but a ruler consumed by hubris and doomed to failure. Sigismund's failure in the Crusades was not just a military defeat, it was a symbolic one. His inability to achieve any lasting victories against the Ottomans shattered the myth of his divine favor and his role as the protector of Christendom. The Crusades had been his opportunity to redeem himself, to erase the humiliation of Nicopolis and prove that he was a capable leader who could fight for God's will. Instead, they revealed the depths of his incompetence and the emptiness of his self-proclaimed title as the savior of Christianity. His military failures became a reflection of his broader failures as a ruler. A man who refused to listen to reason, who ignored the advice of his military commanders, and who refused to acknowledge the human cost of his ambitions. The battles were lost, but the damage to his reputation was far more profound. Sigismund had pushed forward with his crusade not to defend Christendom, but to defend his own pride. The result was not only a failure to defeat the Ottomans, but a destruction of the very image of himself that he had so carefully crafted. In the end, Sigismund's crusade ended not with victory, but with disgrace. His military campaigns became a cautionary tale, a lesson in the dangers of hubris and the consequences of pursuing a cause without regard for the realities of war. His stubbornness and refusal to accept defeat had led him down a path of destruction, where every failed campaign deepened his cruelty and eroded any remaining support from his people and his allies. The people of Hungary, who had already suffered under his reign of terror, now found themselves enduring the consequences of his pride and stubbornness. Sigismund's military failures did not just cost him battles, they cost him the support of his kingdom and the trust of his people. His refusal to acknowledge his mistakes and his obsession with pushing forward with a campaign that was already lost destroyed his ability to lead effectively. In his desperate pursuit of glory, he had led his kingdom into ruin, leaving behind only the broken remnants of a once proud nation. Sigismund's final failure in the crusade was the culmination of his years of reckless leadership. It was a sobering reminder of the perils of unchecked ambition and the dangers of stubbornness in the face of failure. His inability to accept his losses, to learn from his mistakes, and to put the interests of his people above his own pride ensured that he would never achieve the victories he so desperately sought. Instead, Sigismund's legacy would be one of failure, cruelty, and destruction. A king who, despite his title as the protector of Christianity, was ultimately undone by his own hubris and the empty promises of his divine mission. His military campaigns, far from elevating him to the status of a great crusader, only sealed his fate as a ruler who had let his ambition consume him, dragging his kingdom down with him. Sigismund's final failure in the crusade marked not just the end of his military aspirations, but the collapse of the very image he had constructed for himself. A shattered figure whose legacy was defined not by triumph, but by tragedy. The reign of Sigismund is etched into history not in ink but in scars and ashes, for his governance is not marked by wisdom or benevolence, but by a merciless tyranny that crushes all beneath it. He does not rule, he dominates. His power is not respected but feared. His commands not followed out of loyalty, but from a paralyzing terror that seeps into the very bones of his subjects. From the moment he seized power, through schemes soaked in betrayal and the blood of former allies, Sigismund made it clear that he would tolerate no questioning of his authority, no whisper of defiance, no flicker of dissent. The foundations of his empire were laid not with stone, but with the broken bodies of those who dared to dream of freedom. Sigismund's iron fist is not a metaphor. It is the true weight of his wrath made manifest. He did not simply punish rebellion. He annihilated it, buried it under layers of cruelty, so profound that even the idea of resistance became a death sentence. To speak out against his rule was not only suicidal but contagious. Entire families would vanish if a single member expressed dissatisfaction with the regime. This was not governance. It was a reign of psychological and physical horror. Villages that once thrived with laughter and commerce were turned into graveyards, silent and still, populated only by the memories of the executed. The very air seemed to stiffen under his watchful gaze, and even the shadows seemed wary of moving too boldly in his presence. The reach of his tyranny extended to every corner of society. No man, woman, or child was exempt. Loyalty was not enough. Absolute, unquestioning devotion was the only currency that bought survival, and even that was never guaranteed. Sigismund would often test the faith of his most ardent followers with impossible demands, orders that required the sacrifice of loved ones, or the public denouncement of family. He reveled in watching loyalty fracture under the unbearable pressure he applied, as if savoring the slow, deliberate destruction of the human spirit. To him, loyalty was not a virtue but a tool, something to manipulate and break at will, and nothing delighted him more than watching those who once loved him grovel in the dirt for mercy he would never bestow. Sigismund's palaces were mausoleums of torment, their grand facades hiding dungeons where screams echoed through stone halls like ghostly hymns to his cruelty. The methods of punishment employed within were not born of necessity, but of sadistic imagination. Torture, under Sigismund's command, evolved into a grotesque art form. Prisoners were not simply executed. They were erased body and soul, in rituals of agony so elaborate and prolonged that death became a mercy begged for and too often denied. Men were flayed alive while their families were forced to watch. Women were mutilated not just in body but in identity, stripped of every shred of dignity. He ensured that punishment was not only physical but symbolic, designed to send a message so potent that it lingered long after the flesh had rotted from the bones of the condemned. He had special enforcers for these tasks, monstrous brutes whose loyalty to Sigismund bordered on the fanatical. These beasts, clad in blackened armor with faces hidden behind emotionless iron masks, moved through towns like omens. Their arrival heralded purges, inquisitions, and public executions designed to stoke fear as much as to eliminate threats. They dragged people from their homes in the dead of night, ignoring cries, pleas, and prayers. They turned markets into execution grounds and churches into prisons. Their hands were soaked in so much blood that even their armor seemed to reek of death. But it was Sigismund's voice that guided them, his commands that dictated who lived and who died, and his cold gaze that watched unwavering, as lives were destroyed in his name. Sigismund's brutality did not stop at punishing threats. He created them, fabricated dissent when none existed, simply to justify his monstrous acts. He would accuse innocent towns of treason, just to remind the rest of the empire what defiance looked like. In one chilling example, he ordered the execution of an entire village because a child had scribbled something unflattering about him on a wall. The villagers were rounded up and made to watch as their homes were set ablaze. Then came the mutilations, the hangings, the crucifixions. He made sure it was all public, documented, and disseminated as a warning to others. No crime was too small, no punishment too severe. He even corrupted the very concept of justice. His courts were mockeries, rigged trials held in blood-slick halls where verdicts were written before the accused even entered. Evidence was irrelevant. Witnesses were coerced or executed, and defense was treated as defiance. The only verdict was guilt, and the only sentence was death. These spectacles were not just exercises in control, they were theater. Sigismund took pleasure in crafting elaborate executions that served as twisted entertainments for his inner circle. Nobles who laughed and cheered as enemies of the state were burned, torn apart by beasts, or slowly drowned in vats of acid. It was horror masquerading as law, tyranny parading in the robes of order. His paranoia, too, fed the furnace of cruelty. The more power he accumulated, the more he feared its loss. He saw betrayal in every glance, conspiracy in every whisper. This madness led to the purging of his own court. Advisors who had served him for years were suddenly accused of treason and executed without trial. Their families were dragged down with them, as were their friends, their servants, even their pets. No link, however tenuous, could be allowed to survive. Sigismund believed that power could only be preserved through perpetual terror, and so he ruled not from a throne of gold, but from a fortress of bones. Even his soldiers feared him, despite being the instruments of his oppression. For every battle they won, Sigismund demanded tribute, not in gold, but in loyalty proven by blood. Those who hesitated to execute his cruelest orders were labeled as weak and executed themselves. In one infamous campaign, after the conquest of a rebellious province, Sigismund ordered the mass rape and pillage of its capital, not for strategic gain, but as retribution, and as a twisted reward for his men. Those who refused were strung up beside the conquered. Mercy became treason, and humanity was purged from his legions, just as dissent was purged from his lands. The brutality was systemic, institutionalized, codified into law and ritual. New recruits were required to undergo initiation rites that involved acts of brutality against prisoners, both to test their loyalty and to sever them from morality. Children were raised not to think, but to obey. They were taught to praise Sigismund in hymns and swear allegiance with oaths soaked in blood. Schools became factories of indoctrination. History was rewritten, art censored, and religion twisted until all that remained was Sigismund's cult of personality, a grotesque parody of divinity where he was both god and devil. There were statues of him in every city, towering over the crumbling remains of what had once been monuments to liberty and culture. These massive effigies depicted him not as a man, but as a war god armored and expressionless, with burning eyes and fists clenched in eternal judgment. Beneath their shadows, public floggings were carried out. People were forced to kneel before them, to weep in gratitude for his mercy, to kiss the feet of the sculpted tyrant while the real one watched from afar, smiling coldly. Even architecture became a tool of domination. His buildings were massive, oppressive, designed to dwarf the human spirit and remind all who entered that their lives were nothing but dust before his might. And Sigismund was tireless. He slept little and dreamed less. When others grew weary of bloodshed, he remained steadfast in his crusade of domination. When his advisors begged for diplomacy, he silenced them with executions. Peace was weakness, negotiation cowardice. He thrived in war, in chaos, in the sound of screams and the crack of the whip. He had no use for prosperity unless it was earned through suffering. He believed a people must crawl before they could walk, must bleed before they could serve. And so he bled them dry, of hope, of joy, of identity, until they became little more than husks, drifting through life in fear, unable to remember a time before his reign. Yet despite it all, Sigismund considered himself righteous. In his mind, he was not a tyrant but a savior. He believed that only through absolute control could true order be achieved. He saw the horrors he inflicted not as sins, but as necessary sacrifices. He looked upon the world he had scarred and saw beauty in its obedience. To him, the silence of a terrorized people was sweeter than song, the submission of the masses, more noble than any uprising. He did not seek to inspire love. He considered love fickle and foolish. He sought to instill fear, for fear was eternal. Love could be broken, twisted, turned, but fear endured. And so he ruled with it, bathed in it, breathed it. There are few rulers in history as infamous as Sigismund, and fewer still whose cruelty matched his. His name became a curse, a warning, a shadow cast long after his death. His governance was a scar that never healed, a legacy of torment etched into the psyche of generations. He was not simply a man who ruled with an iron fist. He was the iron fist, unrelenting and merciless, a monument to what happens when power is unchecked and compassion is forgotten. Under Sigismund, humanity was not governed. It was broken, reshaped into a tool of obedience, and left to wither in the cold, blood-soaked shadow of tyranny. Sigismund's rule, forged in fire and sustained through sheer force, became a suffocating cage not just for the people of Hungary, but for Sigismund himself. At the heart of his reign lay a fatal flaw, its utter lack of legitimacy. He had clawed his way to the throne not through tradition or the will of the people, but through a blood-soaked path of betrayal, manipulation, and merciless conquest. His authority was not inherited, earned, or bestowed. It was seized, wrested violently from those who once held it, and crushed beneath the iron weight of his ambition. And for all the fortresses he constructed and all the armies he commanded, he could never build what he lacked most: true acceptance. Every title he claimed, every crown he wore, rang hollow in the ears of those who remembered how he came to power. In the eyes of the nobles, the clergy, the common folk, and the foreign courts alike, Sigismund was not a rightful king, but a usurper in royal garb, a tyrant masked in majesty. The consequences of this foundational illegitimacy were catastrophic. Sigismund was painfully aware that he was not loved, not even respected, only feared. That fear became both his weapon and his prison. It was the single pillar upholding his reign, and so he guarded it with an almost obsessive paranoia. Every decision, every decree, every bloody crackdown was designed to reinforce the illusion of unassailable power. But power rooted in terror is power that must be constantly fed. And Sigismund, recognizing the fragility of his throne, chose to sustain it through escalating cruelty. The more his people hated him, the more brutal he became to suppress their hatred. The more his nobles plotted behind closed doors, the more ruthlessly he hunted them down. Every whisper of rebellion was met with overwhelming violence, not to contain it, but to send a message that Sigismund did not rule by divine right or political consensus, but by sheer, relentless domination. Yet fear, unlike loyalty, has a limit. It rots the soul of a kingdom from within, turning citizens into cowards, warriors into deserters, and allies into enemies. Under Sigismund's regime, trust vanished from the fabric of society. No one dared speak freely, even in their own homes, for walls had ears and neighbors turned informants to save themselves. The nobility, once proud custodians of Hungary's legacy, became hollow courtiers, pawns in a macabre chess game where a single wrong move led to execution. Entire families were extinguished for imagined slights, their estates seized, their names erased. And as Sigismund's grip tightened, so too did the resistance grow. Not in open battlefields, but in hushed conspiracies, in secret meetings, in the hearts of those who could no longer stomach the weight of their king's atrocities. The more he crushed dissent, the more it festered, becoming an invisible but ever-expanding crack in the foundation of his rule. Internationally, Sigismund's name became synonymous with barbarism. Once proud alliances forged through centuries of diplomacy and shared bloodlines were shattered under the pressure of his madness. Monarchs who once regarded Hungary as a peer now treated it as a pariah. Envoys stopped arriving. Treaties dissolved in silence. Trade dwindled to a trickle, and whispers of sanctions began to echo through the royal courts of Europe. Even those nations that dared to maintain contact did so with disdain, speaking to Sigismund with forced courtesy while plotting his downfall in private. His tyranny had turned Hungary into a cautionary tale, a once glorious kingdom now isolated, bleeding from within, and teetering on the brink of collapse. Foreign rulers spoke of Hungary not as a sovereign state, but as a cursed land, enslaved to the whims of a mad tyrant whose insatiable hunger for control had extinguished every spark of diplomacy. Sigismund, naturally, viewed this international scorn as confirmation of his righteousness. In his twisted worldview, enemies were a sign of strength, isolation a badge of honor. He saw opposition not as a consequence of his brutality, but as proof of the world's weakness, of their fear of his might. He believed that Hungary could and should stand alone, that it was not a member of the European tapestry, but a singular, unbreakable empire forged in his image. And so, in the face of growing international condemnation, he doubled down. He withdrew from councils, rejected envoys, and accused foreign powers of conspiring against him. His proclamations became unhinged tirades, delivered with thunderous fury to trembling audiences who dared not look him in the eye. He spoke of global conspiracies, of divine missions, of enemies at every border. His paranoia spread like a plague through his administration, infecting even his most trusted advisors. Ministers were purged for imagined affiliations. Generals were executed on suspicion of secret correspondence with foreign courts. Hungary's foreign policy, once built on subtle diplomacy and regional cooperation, collapsed into a morass of isolationism and militarism. The economic consequences were immediate and devastating. Trade routes dried up. Ports became desolate. Markets once filled with exotic wares turned barren. The kingdom, deprived of vital resources and external commerce, began to wither. Inflation spiraled. Hunger spread. Entire provinces fell into poverty, their farmlands abandoned, their populations fleeing or dying. Infrastructure crumbled, and disease followed in its wake. Roads went unmaintained. Bridges collapsed. Hospitals closed. Yet Sigismund, ever blind to the suffering of his people, saw these failures not as results of his tyranny, but as signs of internal sabotage. He blamed the poor for their poverty, the sick for their weakness, and the desperate for their desperation. Relief efforts were minimal, often tied to forced labor or political loyalty. Food was rationed not by need but by obedience. Those who bowed received crumbs. Those who dared to protest were left to starve or worse. In his desperation to maintain power amid growing chaos, Sigismund turned increasingly toward spectacle. Public executions became weekly events, meant to remind the people that their suffering had a face, and that face was their king's. He paraded traitors through the streets, their bodies broken and mouths sewn shut, as a warning against disobedience. He unveiled grotesque monuments, statues of himself towering over the ruins of once thriving cities, murals depicting him slaying dragons adorned with the faces of his political enemies. These performances were not just acts of cruelty, but calculated tools of psychological warfare. He wanted his people to see him as omnipotent, immortal, beyond reproach. He believed that if he could not be loved, then he would be feared into legend. But even legends rot. The longer Sigismund ruled, the more desperate his attempts to mask the kingdom's unraveling became. Rebellions flared at the fringes, no longer small or sporadic but organized and widespread. Peasant uprisings gained traction, bolstered by defected soldiers and disillusioned nobles. Border provinces declared independence, aligning themselves with foreign powers eager to see Sigismund fall. His once mighty army became fractured, riddled with deserters and plagued by infighting. Morale collapsed. Battles were lost not due to inferior numbers, but due to lack of will. His soldiers no longer believed in the cause. They fought only to avoid the punishment of retreat. Meanwhile, his inner circle dwindled. Those who had survived the purges did so by becoming empty husks, sycophants with no ambition, no conviction, no capacity for governance. The machinery of the state slowed to a crawl. Decisions were delayed, edicts ignored, provinces abandoned to chaos. As pressure mounted from every direction, internal strife, external threats, economic collapse, Sigismund did not bend. He hardened. He refused to yield even an inch of power, refused to acknowledge his failures, refused to entertain the idea of reform. In his mind, the problem was not the brutality of his rule, but the weakness of those beneath it. He spoke of purifying the kingdom, of purging it of unworthy blood, of building a new empire from the ashes of the old. His speeches became apocalyptic, tinged with delusions of grandeur and divine right. He declared himself chosen, ordained to suffer for the sins of the world. He demanded absolute devotion, not to Hungary, but to himself. Dissent was no longer political, it was blasphemy. His enemies were not just traitors, they were heretics. And thus, the line between tyranny and insanity disappeared. The state ceased to function as a government and became a machine of cult-like oppression. Ministries were replaced by tribunals. Schools were turned into indoctrination centers. Children were forced to memorize the truths of Sigismund, a grotesque catechism of loyalty, sacrifice, and hatred. Art, once a flourishing aspect of Hungarian culture, was reduced to propaganda. Music was censored, literature burned, theater outlawed unless it glorified the regime. Spies infiltrated every sector of life, posing as merchants, teachers, even priests, reporting back to a central intelligence network that answered only to Sigismund. The church itself fractured under the weight of his intrusion. Bishops were imprisoned. Saints were desecrated. The divine was no longer sacred. Only Sigismund was. Yet for all his efforts, the cracks continued to spread. And beneath it all was that ever-gnawing truth. His rule, brutal and far-reaching though it was, had never been legitimate. It had never been accepted by the people, never sanctified by tradition or faith. His power was built upon fear, and fear alone could not endure forever. When the weight of a nation rests solely upon violence, it becomes brittle, prone to shatter under the slightest shift. And shift it did. The world began to change around Sigismund. Foreign powers, emboldened by his isolation, began to intervene. Secret coalitions formed. Assassins were trained. Exiled nobles returned with foreign backing. And within Hungary, hope began to stir, faint and fragile, but real. Songs were sung in secret again. Symbols of rebellion appeared carved into walls. Underground movements gathered strength. Sigismund could feel it slipping, even if he refused to acknowledge it. He increased the purges, doubled the patrols, raised more taxes to fund more weapons, built more prisons, more gallows, more monuments to his vanishing glory. But the damage was done. His terror, once total, had overreached. The people were no longer afraid, only angry, desperate, and ready. And in the cold light of history, Sigismund would not be remembered as a monarch or a reformer or even a warrior. He would be remembered as a tyrant, one who mistook brutality for authority, who mistook silence for obedience, who mistook control for legitimacy. In the end, his was not a reign, it was a siege. A siege upon the hearts of his people, upon the soul of his kingdom, upon the very idea of what Hungary could have been. His iron fist had ruled, yes, but it had also choked the life out of the nation he claimed to serve. And as the storm gathered on the horizon, there was only one certainty. Tyranny, however absolute, can never truly replace legitimacy. And cruelty, no matter how boundless, cannot forever silence the will of the people. By the time the first whispers of revolt began to reach the ears of the court, Sigismund had already poisoned the soil of his own kingdom so thoroughly that nothing but rebellion could grow. For years, he had ruled Hungary through savagery and absolute control, crushing opposition with such ruthless precision that even the air seemed to carry the weight of his presence. He had turned the kingdom into a prison, each city a cell, each home a place of dread. Fear was his chosen weapon, sharpened over time into a blade that cut indiscriminately, severing not only dissent, but also the spirit of the nation. But like all blades used without restraint, it dulled through overuse. And as the years passed and the atrocities mounted, the people's terror began to shift into resentment, then hatred, and finally into something far more dangerous, defiance. His tyranny had planted the seeds of his own downfall, and now those seeds were beginning to bloom in fire and blood. The earliest signs were subtle. Murmurs in the markets, quiet songs of protest sung under breath, strange markings carved into the stone walls of alleyways. These acts were insignificant on their own, but they reflected a change, a shift in the hearts of the people. Where once there had been silence, now there were voices. Where once there had been bowed heads, now there were eyes filled with fury. At first, Sigismund responded with the same cold brutality he had always employed. His enforcers, the monstrous iron-masked figures who roamed the land with the authority of executioners, descended upon villages suspected of harboring rebels and left behind smoldering ruins and mass graves. Children were hung beside their parents, corpses stacked in public squares as warnings to others. Entire provinces were put under martial law, curfews enforced with the whip and sword. But these methods, once so effective, began to fail. The people were no longer frozen by fear. They were enraged by it. Soon, scattered uprisings erupted across the kingdom. In the far eastern provinces, a group of farmers armed with tools and stolen swords ambushed a convoy of tax collectors and left them impaled outside the town hall. In the north, a militia composed of former soldiers and deserters overtook a garrison, killing the commander and claiming the region for the rebellion. These acts were met with swift and vicious retaliation. Sigismund's army burned villages, executed thousands without trial, and razed fields to the ground. Yet for every rebel crushed, two more rose. The brutality that had once cowed the people now only strengthened their resolve. Sigismund had taught them cruelty, and they had learned it well. The rebels mirrored his tactics: ambushes, terror strikes, assassinations. And they began targeting his supply lines, intercepting messages, poisoning wells used by his troops. They became ghosts in the night, striking and vanishing, leaving Sigismund's forces exhausted and demoralized. Within his own court, unrest began to spread like a disease. Nobles who had once pledged loyalty out of fear now questioned the cost of their allegiance. They had watched their peers executed without cause, their properties seized, their bloodlines extinguished on mere suspicion. The crown no longer promised protection. It demanded servitude and offered only death in return. Rumors swirled through the palace halls that Sigismund's mind was deteriorating, that he spoke to phantoms, that he saw betrayal in every glance. His inner circle grew smaller as paranoia consumed him. Ministers vanished overnight, their quarters sealed, their names struck from records. He began issuing decrees at random, commanding impossible tributes, and threatening entire cities with extermination if his demands were not met. Even those closest to him lived in constant fear, wondering when their loyalty would be declared insufficient. The nobility, sensing opportunity amid the chaos, began aligning with rebel factions in secret. Letters were sent in coded language. Meetings were held in the dead of night. Bribes flowed to secure alliances, and hidden caches of weapons were smuggled into rebellious regions. Some nobles offered their own troops to the cause, hoping that the collapse of Sigismund's rule would allow them to seize power in the aftermath. What had begun as scattered unrest was fast becoming a coordinated civil war. Sigismund, in his madness, responded not with strategy but with sheer violence. He ordered mass executions of suspected traitors within the court. Entire bloodlines were extinguished. Castles were seized, titles revoked, and lands salted. Where once Hungary's aristocracy had upheld the king's rule, now it actively worked to undermine it. The royal army, once a symbol of national strength, became a reflection of the regime's decay. Desertions increased by the day. Morale plummeted. Soldiers, weary of executing their own countrymen, began to mutiny. Some units defected entirely, pledging loyalty to rebel commanders. Sigismund tried to replace these defectors with fresh recruits. Peasants conscripted at sore point and forced into battle with barely any training or equipment. But they were no match for the hardened and increasingly experienced rebels. Defeats piled up, and with each loss, more of the kingdom slipped through Sigismund's fingers. Fortress after fortress fell. Strategic cities declared independence. Regions once firmly under royal control began flying the banners of rebellion. Desperate to preserve the illusion of control, Sigismund enacted decrees that bordered on the insane. He declared martial law in every city still under his rule, ordered the burning of all literature deemed subversive, and commanded that statues of himself be erected in every town square as symbols of eternal authority. He forced the clergy to rewrite religious texts to paint him as a divinely chosen ruler, twisting doctrine to fit his delusions. Churches were defiled in his name, their altars turned into platforms for propaganda. Those who refused were executed in front of their congregations, their blood staining the sacred floors. The holy was no longer holy. It was another tool in Sigismund's arsenal of terror. Yet even this desecration could not silence the rebellion. Religious leaders began to openly defy the crown. Monasteries sheltered rebels. Priests used sermons to speak of liberation. Even the Pope, once an uneasy ally, condemned Sigismund's actions and called for reform. Excommunication loomed like a dagger at the king's throat. And though he dismissed it publicly, Sigismund raged in private, smashing relics, burning icons, executing bishops suspected of treachery. His fury became legend. In one infamous act, he ordered a cathedral full of worshippers to be sealed and set ablaze after rumors spread that its priest had blessed rebel fighters. The screams echoed for hours as the stone walls blackened and cracked under the heat, and Sigismund watched from a distant balcony, unmoved. The economy, already crippled by years of war and mismanagement, completely collapsed under the strain of rebellion. Trade routes were severed. Mines were seized by insurgents. Tax revenues vanished. Desperate for funds, Sigismund resorted to looting his own people, sending soldiers to ransack towns, strip homes of valuables, and conscript labor by force. Gold was melted down, grain seized without compensation, livestock slaughtered or stolen. Famine gripped the land. Diseases spread. People died not only in battle but in their beds, starving, sick, and forgotten. And still, Sigismund refused to yield. He hoarded what wealth remained within the palace walls, feeding only those who pledged undying loyalty, while the rest of the kingdom withered. As the kingdom crumbled, so too did the myth of Sigismund's invincibility. For years, he had presented himself as untouchable, a force of nature, a god among men. But now, his armies were losing, his allies vanishing, his people rising against him. Assassination attempts increased. There were poisonings, failed ambushes, even attempted coups within the royal court itself. Each attempt was met with a new wave of purges, and the palace became a charnel house, floors slick with blood, walls echoing with death. Servants trembled at every footstep. Guards turned on one another. The king's own bodyguards were replaced weekly, as no one could be trusted for long. Every shadow became a threat. Every silence, a conspiracy. In his desperation, Sigismund ordered the construction of a new fortress, a monolithic tower of stone meant to stand as his last bastion, a monument to his unyielding will. Thousands were forced to work on it, day and night, under the whip and the sword. Many died in its creation, their bones buried beneath the foundation. But even as it rose toward the heavens, it stood not as a symbol of strength, but of madness. It was a folly, an arrogant monument built by a man who had lost touch with the reality that surrounded him. From its heights, he issued decrees that no one followed, raged against betrayals that existed only in his mind, and plotted vengeance against a kingdom that no longer recognized his rule. Eventually, even his closest generals turned on him. One by one, the commanders who had survived years of war and atrocity began defecting to the rebel cause. They brought with them strategic knowledge, key fortresses, and hardened troops. Battles that might have once ended in stalemates now turned into crushing defeats for Sigismund's dwindling forces. The walls began to close in. Rebel armies marched closer to the capital. Saboteurs infiltrated the palace. Supplies ran dry. Panic gripped what remained of the court. Ministers fled in the night. Guards abandoned their posts. Fires broke out in the outer districts, and no one came to put them out. And still, Sigismund clung to his throne. Even as the walls cracked and the banners of rebellion fluttered outside the city gates, he sat upon his blood-stained seat of power, wearing his armor, surrounded by the corpses of those who had once served him. He refused to flee. He refused to surrender. He gave speech after speech to empty halls, promising retribution, demanding loyalty, declaring that Hungary would bow to him or burn. He believed that through sheer will, he could reverse the tide. But his kingdom had already burned. His subjects were no longer subjects, they were enemies. And the throne he guarded so jealously was nothing more than a gilded tomb. The final revolt was not a grand battle, but a reckoning. When the capital fell, it was not to foreign invaders, but to his own people. They stormed the palace not with siege engines, but with torches and fury. His last defenders laid down their arms. The gates were opened from within. And as the rebels surged through the corridors, they found a kingdom in ruins, a palace of madness, and a king who had already died, if not in body, then in spirit. Sigismund was found in his tower, raving to phantoms, still clutching the scepter that had long since lost its power. His eyes were hollow, his voice a whisper. He did not fight. He did not flee. He simply stared as the people he had tormented for decades finally dragged him from his throne and brought his reign of terror to an end. Thus fell the tyrant, not with honor, not with grace, not even with resistance, but with the silent collapse of a man who had ruled by fear and found himself utterly alone when that fear turned to rage. His legacy was ash, his name a curse, his kingdom a shattered relic of what might have been. And though his monuments would be torn down and his laws erased, the scars he left upon Hungary would remain for generations. A brutal reminder of the price of unchecked cruelty, and of a king who ruled with an iron fist until the fist itself crumbled under the weight of its own tyranny. At the height of his arrogance, Sigismund stood before his assembled commanders, cloaked in the banners of faith, declaring himself the chosen protector of Christendom. He spoke not as a man, but as if he were a divine instrument of holy war, destined to carve his name into history with blood and steel. His voice thundered through the cathedral halls like a sermon, proclaiming that God himself had placed the sword in his hand to drive the heathens from Europe's borders. Priests blessed his armor. Artists painted his face with halos. Scrolls were inscribed with verses comparing him to David, Constantine, even Christ himself. And yet, beneath the sacred veil, behind the gold-threaded robes and pompous declarations, there lurked the same cruel tyrant who had carved out his rule through torture, deceit, and slaughter. His crusade was never about salvation. It was conquest masked in piety, a desperate bid to shroud his tyranny in the divine and cement his fractured reputation with a triumph that would silence his critics. But that triumph never came. What came instead was fire, ruin, betrayal, and the catastrophic unraveling of the myth he had wrapped so tightly around himself. The campaign was doomed from the start. Sigismund, blind to reality and drunk on delusion, surrounded himself with flatterers and sycophants, men too afraid to tell him the truth, too eager to echo his fantasies. He dismissed seasoned strategists who questioned his plans. He ignored intelligence reports that painted a grim picture of the enemy's strength. When advisors warned him of logistical nightmares, treacherous terrain, and unreliable allies, he laughed them off as cowards and saboteurs. His army, hastily assembled from reluctant nobles, conscripted peasants, and mercenaries who fought only for coin, was poorly trained and even more poorly supplied. He treated them not as men, but as instruments of divine will, dispensable and interchangeable. Food was scarce. Discipline was non-existent. Morale wavered under his iron command, yet Sigismund pressed forward, determined to claim glory regardless of the cost. When the first battle began, the illusion crumbled swiftly. What was meant to be a righteous charge against the infidel hordes turned into a slaughter. His vanguard, led by noblemen more concerned with honor than tactics, rushed into an ambush and were cut down to the last man. Sigismund, instead of adjusting his strategy, raged like a beast. He blamed the dead for cowardice, the living for treason, and God himself for testing his resolve. He ordered retaliatory attacks that made no strategic sense, throwing wave after wave of his forces into hopeless confrontations. His own men began to mutter behind his back, calling him mad, cursed, or worse. Some deserted. Others simply let themselves be killed, unable to endure the futility. Entire battalions disappeared into the mud, the forests, the mouths of the enemy. And still, Sigismund marched on, driven not by duty or even by anger, but by the pathological refusal to admit failure. The final campaign, meant to be the crown jewel of his holy war, was a disaster so complete that even time could not obscure its shame. At the edge of a sun-scorched plain, facing an enemy 3 times his size and 10 times more disciplined, Sigismund ordered a full assault. His officers begged for caution. He had no reserve line, no retreat plan, no fresh supplies. But his pride would not permit hesitation. He rode to the front lines, clad in ornate armor and draped in the symbols of the cross, screaming of martyrdom and destiny, invoking divine wrath with every blow of his sword. For a moment, his soldiers followed, swept up in the spectacle. But when the enemy responded, not with fear but with precision and ferocity, the charge collapsed. Archers rained fire upon them. Cavalry sliced through their flanks. Men screamed and trampled each other. What began as a charge ended as a rout. And in the chaos, Sigismund vanished, not in a blaze of glory, but slinking away into the hills like a beaten dog, abandoning his army to the slaughter he had orchestrated. News of the defeat spread like wildfire, and with it, the legend of Sigismund shattered. The man who had declared himself the sword of God now found himself mocked in taverns and pulpits alike. Where once his name had been uttered with reverence, now it was spat with contempt. Survivors of the crusade told tales not of holy valor but of madness, of a commander so lost in his fantasies that he led tens of thousands to die for his ego. The church, sensing the shift in public sentiment, quietly distanced itself. Papal envoys no longer returned his letters. The blessings stopped. Bishops rewrote sermons to focus on humility and repentance, omitting any mention of the fallen king. His portraits were removed from cathedrals. Hymns once sung in his honor were replaced by dirges mourning the needless dead. And Sigismund, still alive, retreated into his fortress with his pride and his rage, cloaking himself in delusion. He refused to acknowledge the scale of the disaster. He accused his generals of betrayal. He declared that the battle was not a defeat but a divine trial, that God had allowed his enemies to triumph in order to test his faith. He imprisoned those who disagreed, silenced survivors who dared speak the truth, and executed messengers who brought ill news. He hired scribes to rewrite the campaign as a near victory, commissioning new paintings that depicted him standing triumphant over the corpses of heathens, even as mass graves filled the countryside with the remains of his own army. The very ground wept with the blood of his failures, yet Sigismund walked it blind, his legacy rotting beneath his feet. But there was no hiding the truth. The scale of the loss, the sheer waste of human life, could not be erased. Mothers buried sons. Wives mourned husbands. Veterans returned maimed, shattered in both body and mind, cursing the name of the king who had led them into hell. Towns that had sent their strongest to fight were now filled with orphans and widows. The economy, already strained by years of Sigismund's rule, buckled under the weight of the military catastrophe. Farmlands went untended. Trade routes closed. Banditry flourished in the vacuum left by the slain. And through it all, Sigismund raged in his halls, a king without glory, gnawing on the bones of his own failure. He lashed out in all directions. Any who questioned his decisions were branded as traitors or heretics. He accused neighboring states of sabotaging the crusade, claiming that spies had infiltrated his army. In retaliation, he ordered raids on border towns, burning churches and killing civilians, acts of pure vengeance that only deepened his infamy. His court became a nest of fear, its halls echoing with the screams of the tortured. Loyalists were forced to kneel and reaffirm their devotion while kneeling in blood. Those who hesitated were executed. His paranoia became doctrine. He created new titles, new rituals, declaring himself not merely king but holy martyr, chosen prophet, divine sovereign. The crown was no longer a symbol of rule. It was a mask hiding a man consumed by madness. The irony was cruel. He had sought immortality through conquest, hoping to be remembered as a savior of Christendom. Instead, he became its cautionary tale. Historians began to refer to his crusade not as a holy war, but as a suicidal vanity project. Monks recorded his failures in painstaking detail, warning future generations against the arrogance of kings who claimed divine right as an excuse for bloodshed. His name became synonymous not with bravery or faith, but with folly and carnage. Even children in distant provinces grew up hearing stories of the mad king who led thousands to their deaths for the sake of pride and painted himself a saint in their blood. And yet, Sigismund persisted, unwilling to accept his fall. He held court with dwindling audiences, issuing proclamations to a realm that no longer listened. He declared holidays celebrating victories that never occurred. He built statues of himself wielding a sword alight with holy fire, erected in cities that had long since stopped paying tribute. These monuments stood as grotesque reminders of his delusion. Empty stone husks erected by forced labor, surrounded by starving peasants who cursed his name in silence. Even within his stronghold, the walls whispered rebellion. Servants vanished. Guards plotted. Courtiers faked loyalty while sharpening daggers beneath their cloaks. As the years wore on, Sigismund's isolation deepened. Once hailed as a savior, he became a pariah, both feared and pitted. Foreign courts mocked him openly. Pamphlets circulated across Europe depicting him as a fool wearing a crown, blindfolded, wading through rivers of blood. Artists painted him with hollow eyes and cracked armor, surrounded by phantoms of the dead. Poets wrote verses of sorrow and rage, turning his crusade into metaphor for every failed promise, every tyrant who cloaked tyranny in righteousness. And through all of this, the man himself faded, not in body, for he lived on, but in stature, in meaning, in legacy. His was a fall not from grace, but from fantasy, and it was a long, brutal descent into historical damnation. What remained of his military was broken beyond repair. The once feared legions that had marched under his banner with fire in their hearts were now ghosts, leaderless, starving, directionless. Officers were either dead or had defected. The command structure had dissolved into a chaos of fragmented loyalties and power-hungry warlords. With no crusade left to fight, and no glory left to chase, these remnants of his army turned on the very land they were once sworn to protect. Pillaging and unrest became common, even in provinces still loyal to the crown. In the vacuum of legitimate leadership, chaos reigned. Sigismund had spent his reign trying to prove that brutality was strength, that fear was loyalty, that power alone could shape destiny. His crusade had been his greatest gamble. The grand gesture that was meant to silence his critics, unite his people, and sanctify his rule with divine favor. But its failure had done the opposite. It had exposed him. It had stripped away the gilded veneer and revealed the monster beneath. And in doing so, it had irrevocably tarnished what remained of his legacy. He was no longer a ruler. He was a monument to his own folly, a living corpse presiding over a kingdom of ashes. So ends the tale of the crusade, not in triumph, not in martyrdom, but in ignominy. Sigismund's vision of salvation had become a nightmare. His dream of divine approval transformed into a curse that consumed everything it touched. His soldiers, his people, his reputation, all sacrificed on the altar of a lie. And though he would continue to wear the crown and bark orders from behind his fortress walls, the world had moved on. The world remembered. And history, ever cruel and ever just, sealed his fate not with reverence, but with revulsion. Sigismund's reign, once upheld by a ragged coalition of powerful nobles, foreign allies, and fearful subordinates, began unraveling as the cost of his cruelty revealed itself in naked daylight. These alliances had never been grounded in friendship or loyalty, but in convenience and coercion, held together by fear of his wrath and the promise of shared spoils. But fear, like a blade pressed too long against the skin, eventually dulls. And when rumors of utter disaster and moral decay reached distant courts and hesitant nobles, those fragile alliances began to fracture. It started quietly. A noble who stopped returning Sigismund's letters, a foreign duke who declined his summons, a commander who offered vague excuses for abdicating orders. Each defection was like a crack in the dam, barely noticeable at first, easily dismissed but steadily widening. Sigismund, convinced that tyranny would always enforce union, failed to see the devastation lurking beneath the surface. His alliances were not bonds. They were chains forged by fear, and once the fear began to fade, those chains shattered. The first clear betrayal came when a trusted advisor, someone Sigismund had raised from low birth, who had once carved his name into stone alongside the king's, publicly withdrew support, denouncing Sigismund's brutality as barbarism. He issued a statement not in whispers but in public proclamations, condemning torture chambers, mass executions, and the seizure of land to feed Sigismund's ego. This defection was followed by others. Generals who had led ruthless raids turned coat. They brought with them knowledge of supply lines and intimate knowledge of Sigismund's military routines. They declared the king a false protector, an intoxicated despot who had tarnished the name of Christendom with his cruelty. Diplomats whom Sigismund had once counted on for foreign recognition began closing their embassies, returning or refusing the regalia Sigismund granted them in token allegiance. The shock of betrayal was not mitigated by surprise. Sigismund had known, if only subconsciously, that his brutality had forged enemies from allies. But the emotional blow was nonetheless devastating. He had once shared laughter, raised tanks of wine, and made plans with these men. Now they turned on him, severing ties to protect their own survival. The emotional isolation bit harder because the betrayals came not from strangers but from those he trusted most, those whose loyalty he had bought or bullied into existence. Sigismund attempted to quell the rising dissent with the only tool he possessed, violence. He declared traitor lists, executed heralds, raised estates. When nobles fled to neighboring encomiendas, he sent assassins, poisoners, black market killers to eliminate them. He revoked titles and cursed families. He burned the estates of the traitors until their ashes lit up the night sky as warnings. Yet with each act of retribution, more defected. They saw in his fury the confession of fear. Sigismund thought vengeance would deter betrayal, but instead it confirmed that his alliances were weakening. He was a tyrant unraveling before his own fury. His rage became indiscriminate. He punished entire clans for the actions of one member. He seized the lands of untainted families to feed his retribution. He demanded loyalty oaths from children. He took noble hostages and flayed their messengers alive for minor infractions. His retribution was not political. It was personal. He punished loyalty as if it were a weakness, disloyalty as divine proof of conspiracy. In response, even the bravest nobles began hedging their bets. They sent secret envoys to rebel courts, shared whispers of revolt, offered sons as hostages in exchange for safety. Sigismund responded with paranoia and more cruelty, closing courts, burning libraries, arresting secret emissaries, only deepening his solitude. As his political isolation grew, Sigismund found that the machinery of governance faltered. His council chambers, once full of voices advising on diplomacy, war, finance, now rang empty or were filled with sycophants too terrified to speak. The once flourishing bureaucracy began to decay. Advisors either fled in fear or were silenced in chains. Laws were arbitrarily revoked or rewritten overnight, leaving towns without governance, commerce crumbling under unpredictable edicts. Local governors, sensing the rot at the core, began ignoring binding orders. They held assemblies without informing the crown, asserting semi-autonomy. Tax farmers refused to collect. Regions refused to send tribute. Borders became porous as guards deserted or turned rebel. Even his personal guard became unreliable. They watched him with cold eyes, unwilling to risk their futures defending a king who had abandoned his own honor. His isolation was complete politically. He could issue decrees, but few obeyed. He could demand tribute, but few complied. He had armies, but they were fracturing. His power was a hollow myth sustained only by his own wild belief. This isolation warped Sigismund's mind. Deprived of honest counsel and depleted of allies, he retreated into a twisted inner circle of courtiers too terrified or foolish to contradict him. He rose earlier each dawn, pacing his halls in insomnia-fueled frenzy. He held council with empty chairs, not metaphorically, but literally. Chairs reserved for defectors remained ceremonially placed at the table, unsat, as symbols of their absence, and he shouted orders at those empty seats, imagining their responses. He summoned generals to stand in the center of the hall and confess their imaginary treachery. When they failed to do so convincingly, he had them executed in front of the court, using their deaths to manufacture confessions as warnings. His speeches transformed from proclamations to delusional monologues. He claimed conspiracies among ghosts, plotted revenge on nobles who had been killed years ago, and cursed foreign rulers in languages no one else understood. His rage, once directed at enemies, now seethed inward. He accused his own family of plotting. He dreamed nightly of betrayal in the dark, waking to issue edicts cursing his own reflection. The court halls echoed with the sound of chains, screams, and decrees, delirious orchestration of a king bending under the weight of his cruelty and solitude. Sigismund's personal relationships fractured too. Wives withdrew from his presence. Children hid their faces. Those servants who remained worked in silence, studied every gesture, tiptoed through his chambers for fear their footsteps might be heard as dissent. He lived surrounded by phantoms, not companions. Even those who stayed did so out of fear, not devotion or love. The king who had once dined with nobles at lavish feasts now ate alone at a cold table, chewing bread that tasted of iron. His wine tasted of ashes. Every smile he received felt like a dagger. Every allegiance whispered behind his back. He began suspecting his own shadow of treachery, ordering guards to flog walls for signs of traitorous symbols. Madness seeped into his mental dominion, born of cruelty but sustained by isolation. Without allies, his cruelty became aimless, generalized, lethal to everything around him. Politically isolated, Sigismund discovered that diplomacy evaporated. Foreign courts turned their gaze to new rising powers. Envoys no longer knocked at his gates. Negotiations stopped. Where once tributary states had sent regular gifts, now silence followed. Tributes ceased, ambassador embassies closed. Pillars in his alliances crumbled. He sent envoys to plead, to bribe, to promise reforms, but the letters returned unopened, his gifts returned, horses and gold left at gates untaken. He declared war on those who refused to answer, ordering raids into neighboring lands. But these incursions were half-hearted, plagued by desertion, and easily repelled by foreign armies who faced no loyalty oath to honor. His isolation even weakened his military alliances. Foreign contingents refused to help. Mercenaries deserted mid-campaign. When the final campaign launched, he stood not with an armada of allied troops but an empty phalanx, broken by desertion and treachery. The campaign ended in predictable disaster. There was no rescue because no one came. He had painted enemies in circles of allies, but many had erased his number from their maps. Sigismund's emotional isolation was total. He perceived betrayal everywhere because in his cruelty he had burned the foundations of trust, and now the structure collapsed around him. He became haunted by dreams, voices of former allies weeping, mocking laughter echoing in his sleep, memory of the bishop whose embroidered cloak he'd ripped off in a rage, of the general whose son he had executed. These nightmares mingled with reality until the two were indistinguishable. In the solitude of the night, he stared at portraits of loyalists who had abandoned him, defaced them, scratched their eyes out in drunken fits. He held counsel with corpses of those he had executed, chanting at their empty chairs. He stopped sleeping, living in a haze of suspicion and cruelty redoubled. The betrayal and isolation transformed Sigismund. Gone was the swaggering tyrant, replaced by a hollow figure draped in paranoia and decay. His enemies were not only external but woven into the fabric of his court, his family, his identity. The alliances he once valued now lay in charred ruins. Diplomacy was a bitter memory churned into dust. Loyalty had fled the realm along with hope. Alone on his throne, with no allies to command and no power to enforce even basic governance, he became a relic of tyranny, a symbol of cruelty undone by the void his cruelty had created. His remaining forces enforced laws only in fragments. Parleying envoys bribed their way past checkpoints. Deserting captains brought pistol revolts into the throne room. Entire provinces slipped into de facto independence, pledging fealty to former allies turned rebel leaders, mocking Sigismund's ability to enforce rule beyond his palace walls. In that final chapter, Sigismund stood alone behind locked gates, staring at the banners of defiance raised outside his walls. The courtiers who remained trembled in the corridors. The servants slid away in terror. His fortress, once a symbol of his iron grip, became a tomb of isolation. Its walls held no counsel, only echoes. He had created his own isolation by choosing cruelty over consensus, domination over diplomacy, terror over trust. And now that choice returned to swallow him. Betrayal was not just political. It was woven into the fibers of his rule. Isolation was not imposed by enemies. It was the harvest of the seeds he himself had sown. Thus ended his reign of terror and isolation. A tyrant abandoned, despised, and alone, crushed not by armies, but by the emptiness left in the wake of his own brutality. As the years dragged on toward Sigismund's final days, the brittle framework of his rule began to splinter utterly, leaving behind a crushing void where once there had been terror-wrought order. In those last years his power did not so much decline as collapse, dissolving into chaos he could neither control nor comprehend. His once vast territories, the lands he had seized, burned, tortured so many to secure, slipped like sand through trembling fingers. Provincial governors ignored his decrees, border garrisons mutinied or deserted, and rebellions flared not only at the fringes but in the very heart of his capital. The machinery of governance ground to a halt. Tax revenues collapsed, roving bands pillaged farmland, disease and famine stalked the populace, and his courts echoed with empty seats. Sigismund tried to order marches, demand loyalty, decree peace, but his words carried no weight. He had strangled trust and empathy from his realm, and what remained was a kingdom of frightened strangers, unwilling to heed a ruler who had ceased to rule and only demanded obedience. In the palace's isolation, born from cruelty and sustained by paranoia, transformed into desperate mania. He spent hours wandering deserted halls, barking orders at empty corridors, turning to walls for counsel, expecting conspiracies to answer back. His last trusted aides were too fearful to speak. Courtiers were specters, avoiding even eye contact for fear of invoking his rage. Servants would slip notes under his door rather than stand before him. The air in the palace reeked of broken promises and rotting fruit. Rats gnawed through discarded plans and decrees cast aside as useless. Sigismund reacted by turning violent, not outward but inward. He demolished tapestries depicting former glories, burned chronicles that recorded his deeds, banned songs once praising his name. Then, when the noise outside grew unbearable, he shut the windows so tight that the palace stank of unventilated misery. His cruelty became a tool to silence memory itself, so that not only would no one rise against him, but no one could even recall who he had once been. When troops came to seek orders, he met them with tirades of accusation, that they plotted with rebels, that every grain of food stolen from stores was evidence of treason, that even the council chairs in the meeting rooms were riddled with poison. Generals who begged for clarity were branded traitors. When they offered reports of rebel strength or famine or disease, Sigismund insisted they were lies. He refused to dispatch help. Instead, he executed messengers. Entire battalions vanished, sent to hunt non-existent conspirators, dying of exposure or starvation in the process. His cruelty blinded him to the suffering he had wrought and worsened it with each frantic decree. The kingdom, deteriorating from within, became a landscape of corpses and abandoned homesteads, where rebels burned or claimed villages and royal troops skulked through roads in ragged bands, too few in number to enforce anything but terror. His own health deteriorated under the pressure. He slept less and less, and when he did, he dreamed of betrayal and conspiracies, voices accusing him, ghosts closing around him. Nightmares became day. Wrinkled with sleeplessness, hollow-eyed, he clenched his scepter as though it contained the last vestige of power in the world. He could not let go, though his hold was gone. He summoned councils that never met, signed edicts he knew would be ignored, ordered taxes on provinces already starving. He demanded sacrifices, to appease gods he claimed were conspiring against him. But food rotted and used, and holy men fled the realm. The church, once his reluctant ally, now formally condemned him. Bishops refused to bless his armies. Priests who had once sung hymns in his honor delivered sermons denouncing tyranny, urging people to rebel. Sigismund retaliated by arresting priests, seizing church lands, burning relics, ordering divine punishments enacted upon clergy. But the moral authority he once wielded dissolved. The faithful turned away, deserting altars, sheltering rebels instead of his men. In the last flickers of his power, one saw the grotesque remains of a tyrant utterly alone. Nobles held secret meetings to divide his territories among themselves. Rebel governors declared independence outright, raising banners in towns only days before flying Sigismund's colors. Foreign powers seized border passes, claiming them in the name of protecting stability, publicly denouncing Sigismund as a failed despot whose kingdom was not worth the chaos it produced. His envoys arrived to plead for peace or mercy. They were ignored or defied. In desperation, he threatened wars he no longer could fight, alliances he couldn't pay for, laws he could not enforce. The chaos he had once maintained through force now consumed itself. Roads flooded, harvests failed, wells dried up, starvation and plague spread unchecked. Soldiers deserted rather than fight for a king incapable even of feeding them. Entire cities revolted, storming garrisons and executing those who remained loyal. Sigismund had become a puppet king in a half-ruined palace, surrounded by trembling loyalists who hoped for a quick death rather than continued service. Reflection on his rule in those final years was cold and unyielding. The grand ambitions that once masked his cruelty, creating an empire, defending Christendom, building a dynasty, were revealed as shameless delusions. His reign ended not in triumph but in disgrace, defined not by glory but by the agony he had wrought. His legacy became one of suffering. Families torn apart by his purges, whole regions depopulated by his wars, entire generations raised in fear. Maps he once sought to color with dominance now bear scars, ghost towns, ruined castles, borders redrawn by rebels. Historians wrote of him as a cautionary figure, a cruel king who traded legitimacy for terror, who believed fear could replace faith, who crushed his own kingdom in the end to prove he could rule it. Even foreign chroniclers who once portrayed him as a Christian hero now described him as a tyrant fallen from grace, a man consumed by madness and bloodlust. His name became something whispered with dread rather than sung with awe. In the bleakest months, Sigismund attempted one final gesture. An assembly called to demonstrate that he still held sovereignty. But the lords sent excuses, governors sent refusals. Only a handful of broken men came. They sat across from him in the great hall, unspeaking, eyes lowered. He waited for applause. It never came. Instead, they whispered among themselves, withdrawing into alliances that excluded him, plotting his removal, calling him deposed by default. His fury, when it erupted, was terrible to see. He had them flogged, imprisoned, had their houses razed. But the impact was minimal. The gatherings disbanded, the survivors fled or were hunted. Sigismund was left in the empty hall with dust swirling around his boots, muttering prophecies of revenge to walls and cobwebs. The final days of his reign were not epic battles or dramatic sieges, but silence. Silence in halls that once echoed with ambition. Silence in the streets where once marched armies. Silence in the hearts of a people who once feared him. now loathing him. When death came, it was neither glorious nor poetic. Scholars disagree whether he died of plague, of poisoning, or of sheer despair. He collapsed during a fit of rage, maybe clutching his scepter, maybe calling someone a traitor. One servant watched him slump to the floor, lips moving as though cursing invisible conspirators. Another claimed he died laughing at the absurdity of it all. None of it mattered. His passing was understated, almost unnoticed. Guards lowered the banners. No gun salutes, no weeping nobility, no despair in rival courts. Instead, there was relief, a collective exhale from a land long suffocated. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. No funeral procession. No pomp. No songs. His crown lay tarnished in a vault, his scepter shattered. The palace gates closed behind him, and life continued without him. Years later, the echo of Sigismund's cruelty remained in the ruined countryside. Villages deserted, forests grown over battlefields, the broken bones of his legions buried beneath weeds. The institutions he had created to enforce terror, secret police, torture dungeons, forced loyalty oaths, were dismantled, some burned by vengeful peasants. New rulers restored trade, reopened churches, invited refugees home, and funded memorials instead of monuments to fear. In chronicles and songs they told of Sigismund as a lesson. What becomes of a man who sees the world as subject rather than people, who commands by cruelty rather than commands by consent? In the peace that followed, children played in squares where traitors had been executed. Farmers sowed fields once salted. Priests sang hymns in churches built by forced labor. Sigismund's legacy remained, but as a nightmarish example, not a celebrated king. His name invoked shame, not pride. In those final days and the aftermath, the truth was undeniable. His reign had not protected or uplifted, but destroyed. His ambition had built nothing enduring. His power had made no kingdom durable. Instead, he left ruin, ruin in bodies, ruin in hearts, ruin in the land. His final days were not crowned with victory or martyrdom, but were marked by solitude, breakdown, and ignominious end. His legacy is a scar etched into the history of Hungary, a warning that cruelty may seize power temporarily, but only atrocity and ruin endure when legitimacy fails. The reign of Sigismund stands as a grotesque monument to tyranny, a chilling legacy etched not in honor, but in horror. His legacy is not whispered in reverence, but cursed in anger, a reign not of golden triumphs, but of iron chains and rivers of blood. History does not cradle his name in fond remembrance, but recoils from it with disdain. Where once there may have been hope that he would guide Hungary to greatness, that he might rise above the blood-soaked traditions of conquest and rule with wisdom, there is only the shattered ruin of a nation brought to its knees by the very man who swore to protect it. Sigismund's promises of salvation were nothing more than lies forged to deceive and manipulate, honeyed words disguising the fangs of a predator whose thirst for power could never be sated. Every broken oath, every snapped neck, every scream choked into silence beneath the cold stone floors of his torture chambers told the true story of his reign. Not of salvation, but of suffering, not of glory, but of horror. His rule was not one of enlightened governance, but one of domination by fear, built not upon legitimacy or virtue, but upon iron and fire. In his hands, the throne became not a seat of justice, but a pedestal for cruelty, from which he unleashed relentless waves of terror upon his people, burning any hope of unity or prosperity to ash. There is no redemptive epilogue in Sigismund's tale. His methods were not misunderstood genius, nor were they strategic necessities born from desperation. They were the deliberate, calculated choices of a ruler drunk on his own authority, a man who viewed dissent as disease and compassion as weakness. He ruled not as a father to his people, but as an executioner presiding over a vast theater of punishment. Every province that dared whisper resistance was silenced with brutal swiftness. Nobles were flayed alive in the public square to serve as a warning. Entire villages vanished overnight, their homes razed, their citizens thrown into mass graves with no names to mark their passing. Under his rule, the fields of Hungary were watered not by rain, but by blood. There was no sanctuary, no hope for justice. Only the ironclad will of a man who saw himself not as a servant of the people, but as a god over them. When the fires of rebellion began to burn, they were not kindled by foreign agitators or political rivals, but by ordinary men and women desperate to reclaim their humanity from a monster who had stripped them of it. What remains after Sigismund is a nation barely clinging to its identity. Hungary, once a kingdom of promise, is left fractured and feeble. Its people, once bound by shared heritage and pride, are broken, divided by fear, distrust, and grief. The very institutions that should have upheld justice are corrupted, their halls echoing not with debate or reason, but with the sounds of weeping and the screams of the condemned. Generals once loyal to the crown have either fled into exile or turned their blades inward, joining factions vying for control over the decaying carcass of the realm. Churches stand empty, their altars desecrated by bloodshed, their sermons replaced by silence. Even the land itself seems to mourn, its once fertile soil now barren in places where Sigismund's armies once trampled the ground in their crusade for control. Trade collapses, borders dissolve, and Hungary becomes not a kingdom, but a cautionary tale, an empire of ashes held together by the memories of a madman. Sigismund's legacy, therefore, is not a tale of misunderstood ambition, but a brutal indictment of unchecked authority. He is not remembered as a king who tried and failed, but as a tyrant who never tried to be anything else. His name is not sung in ballads or carved into commemorative arches, but spat upon in the whispers of survivors who tell their children never to trust a crown bathed in blood. His reign serves as a warning not just to Hungary, but to all future generations. That power without accountability leads not to strength but to destruction, that cruelty masquerading as order brings not peace but devastation. His story is a reminder of the price of fear, the cost of silence, and the moral rot that festers when violence becomes policy. As the dust settles over the scorched remains of his empire, there is no redemption waiting at the end of Sigismund's path. There is no posthumous glorification, no second chance, no mourning by a grateful nation. He dies as he lived, alone, feared, and despised. The people do not weep for their fallen ruler. They celebrate his passing with quiet relief, like prisoners seeing the gates to their cells swing open at last. But freedom does not come easily after tyranny. The scars he left are not just physical but spiritual, etched into the psyche of a people who were told for too long that survival meant obedience, and that pain was the natural price for peace. In this aftermath, Hungary finds itself not liberated, but lost, its future uncertain, its past a haunting shadow that refuses to fade. Yet perhaps the most damning aspect of Sigismund's rule lies in the twisted normalcy of his terror. What was once unthinkable became routine. Torture chambers became bureaucratic offices of execution, and mass graves became part of the administrative record. His guards did not see themselves as monsters. They were merely doing their jobs, carrying out orders, maintaining the peace, as defined by a man who knew only how to destroy. In this, Sigismund reveals the most terrifying truth of all, that evil, when institutionalized, loses its shape and becomes part of the fabric of daily life. It is not always a matter of dramatic cruelty, but of systematic inhumanity, where suffering is scheduled, tracked, and justified. Sigismund's genius, if it can be called that, was in his ability to turn tyranny into routine, to make cruelty seem inevitable, and to rob his people not just of their lives, but of their very sense of what was right and wrong. What Hungary inherits from Sigismund is not a treasury of victory, nor a tradition of greatness, but a kingdom hollowed out by betrayal. His cruelty did not build a stronger realm. It carved out the heart of a nation and left a shell behind. The diplomatic bridges he burned will take generations to rebuild, and the international scorn he earned cannot be so easily swept aside. Hungary, once seen as a bastion of strength in a volatile region, is now viewed with suspicion and pity. Allies are gone, enemies abound, and even its own citizens question whether they still belong to a nation at all, or merely to the ruins of an idea that Sigismund buried beneath his throne of bones. In final reflection, Sigismund's rule is not a story of missed opportunities or tragic flaws. It is a dark chronicle of deliberate oppression, of a man who saw himself as the state and used that vision to unleash unrelenting cruelty on all who dared question him. There was no justice in his courts, no mercy in his prisons, and no dignity in his governance. What he leaves behind is not a legacy, but a void, a dark scar across the history of Hungary that even time cannot fully erase. His story stands not as a chapter of honor but as a bloody warning, etched into the conscience of a world that must never forget what happens when power is left to rot in the hands of the merciless. In the end, Sigismund is not remembered for what he built, but for all that he broke. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. And now, good night.